Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world where your nose might just lead the way, and a fresh scent had a very, very different meaning. We're stepping back into medieval times, not to discuss castles or knights, but to explore something far more intimate and, frankly, often quite pungent, what hygiene was really like. Forget everything you think you know about daily showers and sparkling clean bathrooms. Imagine a world where bathing was a special occasion, where your clothes might go weeks without a wash, and where the concept of flushing was, well, let's just say it was a lot more hands-on. You probably wouldn't survive more than 10 minutes without wanting to invent deodorant, so let's just observe from a safe, sanitised distance, shall we? You feel the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, stale food, and something vaguely earthy, definitely not pleasant. The sounds are a cacophony of human voices, animal noises, and the occasional splash of something. This is your immediate immersion into a medieval town, where life was lived in close quarters, and the pervasive smells were just a part of the everyday tapestry. This isn't just about personal cleanliness, it's about understanding an entire society's relationship with dirt, disease, and the constant, often losing, battle against filth. The popular image of the unwashed medieval peasant, or the perfume-drenched noble, often oversimplifies a complex reality. While medieval hygiene was undoubtedly different from our modern standards, it wasn't a complete absence of cleanliness. Rather, it was a pragmatic approach, shaped by limited resources, rudimentary scientific understanding, and a prevailing worldview that often connected cleanliness to spiritual, rather than purely physical purity. The reality was a spectrum, ranging from surprisingly fastidious habits in some areas to truly shocking conditions in others. It's like discovering that your great-great-great-grandparents had some truly bizarre ideas about what constituted a healthy snack. The very notion of what constituted clean was fluid. Without knowledge of germ theory, people didn't understand the microscopic link between filth and disease. Their efforts at hygiene were often driven by visible dirt, offensive odours, and cultural norms rather than a scientific understanding of pathogens. This lack of knowledge meant that even their best efforts could sometimes be ineffective or even counterproductive. Imagine trying to fight a ghost with a feather duster. You're putting in effort, but it's not quite hitting the mark. The primary challenges to medieval hygiene were systemic. Access to clean, abundant water was often limited, especially in urban centres. Heating water was a labour-intensive and costly process. Soap, while existing, was often harsh and expensive, and proper waste disposal systems, as we understand them today, were virtually non-existent for the vast majority of the population. These practical limitations meant that even those who desired to be clean faced significant hurdles. The goal here isn't to judge or to sensationalise, but to understand. To peel back the layers of romanticised history and reveal the gritty, smelly, and often surprisingly resourceful reality of everyday life. From the intimate rituals of personal care to the broader challenges of urban sanitation, every aspect of medieval existence was permeated by the pervasive issue of cleanliness, or the lack thereof. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the slight dampness in the air, a faint chill that seems to cling to everything. The light is dim, perhaps from a single flickering candle, casting long shadows across unfamiliar surroundings. You're standing in what might be a common chamber, or perhaps a Lord's simpler room, and already your modern senses are on high alert. The sounds are muted, the creak of old timber, the distant murmur of voices, but it's the smell that truly grounds you here. It's a complex aroma, certainly not unpleasant in every corner, but undeniably earthy, with hints of unwashed wool, damp straw, and something gamey. This pervasive atmosphere is your constant companion, a subtle reminder that the medieval world operated on a different sensory plane. The very air you breathe carries particles that your modern self would instinctively recoil from. But to medieval people, this was simply life. Their olfactory senses, constantly bombarded, likely adapted, tuning out what we would perceive as overwhelming stench. It's like living near a busy road. Eventually, the constant hum of traffic fades into background noise. This adaptation meant that what we consider clean or foul today might have been perceived entirely differently then. a subtle hint of body odour might have been utterly normal, even comforting, while a truly putrid smell, say, from a rotting carcass in the street, would be recognised as genuinely alarming. Now let's talk about the most basic form of personal care: bathing. The popular myth, perhaps fueled by centuries of exaggerated tales, is that medieval people never bathed. This is in fact a gross oversimplification. While daily full-body immersion, as we know it, was rare, bathing was far from non-existent. It was, however, often a more communal, less frequent, and sometimes more ritualistic affair. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval people did bathe, though not with the same frequency or in the same manner as modern Western societies. Imagine a large wooden tub, often lined with linen to prevent splinters, brought into the main chamber or a dedicated bathhouse. Hot water, laboriously heated over a fire, would be poured in. This was not a quick dip. It was a process, often shared among family members or even friends. The water might be infused with herbs, not just for pleasant scent, but for supposed medicinal properties. Rosemary, lavender, mint and chamomile were common additions, believed to cleanse the skin, soothe aches, and ward off illness. It's a bit like a medieval spa day, but with more logistical challenges and probably fewer cucumber slices for your eyes. For the wealthy, personal tubs might be brought to their chambers, offering a modicum of privacy. But for the vast majority, bathing was a more communal activity, occurring perhaps a few times a year, or seasonally, in large public bathhouses that dotted urban centres. These public baths, as you'll discover in a later section, were hubs of social activity, not just places for cleansing. They were places to gossip, to conduct business, and sometimes for less savoury activities. The frequency of bathing varied immensely depending on social class, geographic location, and even religious practice. Monks, for instance, often had more regimented bathing routines as part of their monastic discipline, believing cleanliness of the body reflected purity of the soul. Peasants, whose lives were dictated by agricultural cycles and manual labour, likely bathed less frequently, relying more on spot cleaning and the elements to keep themselves somewhat presentable. Think of it. If you're working in the fields all day, a full bath might feel like a luxury you can't afford in terms of time or resources. Plus, who's going to heat all that water? Probably not you. When a full bath wasn't possible, which was most of the time for most people, partial washing was the norm. You'd likely use a basin of water, perhaps some rough cloth or sponge, and rub down exposed areas like hands, face, and neck. This kind of dry cleaning, or sponge bath, was a daily reality. The concept was to remove visible dirt, rather than to achieve a deep germ-killing cleanse. You'd probably consider it more of a freshen up than an actual wash, which given the prevailing smells might have been a constant uphill battle. The soap available was often harsh, made from animal fats and lye, ash, and could be irritating to the skin. It wasn't the gentle, moisturising soap we're used to. For many, simply water and a cloth was sufficient, or they might use abrasives like sand or pumice for scrubbing rougher parts of the body. This highlights a pragmatic approach to hygiene. Use what you have and focus on what's visible. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval medical treatises actually caution against excessive bathing, believing it could open the pores and make the body more susceptible to illness, particularly during times of plague. This fear, while scientifically unfounded, certainly contributed to less frequent full-body immersion for perceived health reasons. It's like being told that showering too much will give you a cold, so you just decide to skip it for a few weeks. Historians still argue whether the apparent decline in public bathhouses during the later medieval period was primarily due to changing social customs, the increasing association of baths with immorality, or the fear of disease, particularly the Black Death. Regardless, the act of bathing in its various forms was a recognised part of medieval life, though its frequency and methods were profoundly different from our own. It was a complex dance between necessity, practicality, cultural norms, and the ever-present mystery of illness. From the larger concept of infrequent full-body baths, you now narrow your focus to a far more common and essential act of medieval hygiene: hand-washing, a truly practical necessity. Imagine living in a world where food was often eaten with bare hands, where animals roamed freely, and where basic sanitation was rudimentary at best. The simple act of washing your hands, even with just water, became a crucial, though not always perfectly executed, defence against the unseen forces of illness. It's like living in a perpetual germ experiment, and your main defence is a quick rinse under a leaky barrel. You're constantly interacting with your environment, touching tools, animals, communal surfaces, and of course, your own body. Without a scientific understanding of germs, medieval people wouldn't have grasped why hand washing was important on a microscopic level. However, they understood on a very practical, common-sense level that visible dirt and unpleasant smells on their hands were undesirable, especially before eating or after handling certain materials. This is a mainstream historical fact. Hand washing was practiced in medieval times, particularly before meals, due to practical considerations rather than germ theory. Before a meal, especially in noble households or monasteries, basins of water, sometimes infused with herbs or rose water, would be offered for diners to wash their hands. This was less about sterilisation and more about removing visible grime and showing good manners. It was a social ritual as much as a hygienic one. Imagine dipping your fingers into a shared bowl, perhaps alongside several other people, and thinking, "Ah, now that's clean." It's a far cry from the modern mantra of 20 seconds with soap and hot water. For the common folk who often ate directly from shared trenchers, or simply used their fingers to scoop up food, the emphasis was still on cleaning hands, even if it meant simply wiping them on a cloth, rubbing them with sand, or rinsing them in the nearest available water source, which might not always be pristine. The idea was to remove the most obvious layers of dirt and grime that accumulated during the day. If you had been working in the fields or handling animals, a quick rinse would at least remove some of the physical evidence of your toil. Consider the prevalence of communal eating. Everyone dipped into the same pot, tore off pieces of bread with their hands and shared drinking vessels. In such an environment, the cleanliness of hands, even if superficially, was a critical factor in preventing the spread of visible contaminants. While they didn't know about bacteria, they certainly knew that people could get sick, and that visible dirt and foul odours were often precursors to illness. Beyond mealtimes, hand washing would also be a pragmatic necessity after certain activities. If you were a craftsman working with dyes or animal hides, or a peasant handling manure, you would likely make an effort to clean your hands, at least to some extent, simply because the residue would be unpleasant or inconvenient. It's like having sticky fingers after eating a caramel apple. You just have to wash them, even if it's just with spit and a leaf. The materials for hand washing were basic. Soap, as mentioned before, was often harsh and expensive, so plain water was the most common cleanser. Sometimes fine sand or ashes might be used as an abrasive for scrubbing. Towels were also simple, often linen or wool, and their own cleanliness varied wildly. The concept of a single-use towel was, of course, non-existent. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic rules specifically detailed the frequency and methods of hand washing for monks, particularly before and after communal meals, highlighting a more disciplined approach to hygiene driven by religious purity and communal living. It's like a medieval monastery having a strict cleanliness policy pinned to the refectory door. Historians still argue whether the apparent decline in structured communal hand-washing rituals during the later medieval period was due to societal shifts, changing perceptions of cleanliness, or simply a lack of explicit documentation for common practices. Regardless, the act of hand-washing, driven by practical necessity and social convention, rather than scientific understanding, played a continuous, if imperfect, role in medieval personal hygiene. It was a silent daily battle against visible grime, a testament to a pragmatic desire for cleanliness in a world that offered constant challenges to staying clean. Now let's talk about oral care, or rather the medieval attempts to keep your breath from clearing a room and your teeth from falling out. You're probably picturing a world of blackened, rotting teeth and breath that could fell a dragon, right? While there's some truth to that image, the reality was a bit more nuanced, and surprisingly, there were efforts to maintain some semblance of oral hygiene. You're standing in a dimly lit chamber, perhaps the room of a well-to-do merchant or a member of the clergy. The air, while still carrying the general medieval scent profile, has a slightly different edge. There's a hint of something herbal, perhaps mint or cloves, trying to mask the ever-present undertones. This small attempt at freshness is your clue. Someone here is making a conscious effort to combat the dreaded dragon breath. The most basic method of teeth cleaning was simple, rubbing them with a rough linen cloth. It's like using a medieval washcloth for your teeth. This would remove some surface grime and perhaps a bit of plaque, though it wouldn't be as effective as a modern toothbrush. This is a mainstream historical fact. For those who could afford it, there were more elaborate methods. Recipes for medieval toothpastes and powders have been found, often containing abrasive ingredients like salt, powdered charcoal or crushed eggshells. These would have been rubbed onto the teeth with the cloth. Some recipes also included herbs and spices for flavour and supposed medicinal properties, such as sage, rosemary, mint and cinnamon. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with a mixture of salt and charcoal. It's a far cry from minty fresh, but it's something. Mouthwashes also existed, often made from wine or vinegar infused with herbs and spices. These would have been swished around the mouth to freshen breath and perhaps kill some bacteria, though their effectiveness was limited. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval remedies for toothache sound downright bizarre. One involved grinding up ants and blowing the powder into the aching tooth. Another suggested boiling newts and beetles into a powder and applying it to the tooth. It's safe to say you'd probably prefer a modern dentist. For breath freshening, people chewed on herbs and spices like fennel seeds, parsley, cloves and mint. This would have helped to mask odours, though it wouldn't have addressed the underlying causes of bad breath. Historians still debate whether the relatively good dental health found in some medieval skeletons is primarily due to these hygiene practices, the low-sugar diet of the time, or a combination of both. Sugar was a relative rarity in medieval diets, which certainly helped to reduce tooth decay. Beyond the rudimentary tooth scrubbing and breath freshening, your journey into medieval hygiene now turns to a universal constant of human existence: hair care and the perennial struggle against lice and luster. Imagine a world where washing your hair with soap and water was an uncommon luxury, and the constant itching of unwelcome tenants was simply a fact of life for many. It's like living in a permanent bad hair day, but with tiny six-legged accessories you didn't ask for. You're watching a woman, perhaps a servant or a humble villager sitting by a hearth. She's not using a fancy brush or scented shampoo. Instead, she's methodically running a fine-toothed comb through a child's hair, occasionally pausing to pick something out. This isn't just about untangling, it's a routine battle against the pervasive reality of parasites. For most medieval people, hair was rarely washed with soap and water in the way we understand it today. Full head washes were generally part of the infrequent full-body baths, which we discussed in section 1. In between these rare events, hair care involved other methods. The most common approach was dry cleaning, brushing, combing, and sometimes rubbing the hair with cloths or powders. Fine-toothed combs, often made of bone, wood or ivory, were essential tools. They were used not just to detangle and smooth, but crucially, to remove dirt, debris, and most importantly, lice and nits. This is a mainstream historical fact. Combing was a primary method of hair care, essential for managing dirt and parasites. The battle against lice and luster was a constant uphill struggle for almost everyone, regardless of social status. Lice were endemic, easily spread through close contact, shared bedding, or communal spaces. The itching would have been a daily irritation, and the visible presence of lice a source of embarrassment, if not outright social stigma. Mothers would comb their children's hair, and individuals would often help each other, turning hair care into a communal grooming activity. It's like a medieval social bonding ritual, but instead of sharing secrets, you're sharing combs and battling tiny invaders. For attempting to achieve luster, or at least a less greasy look, people used various powders. Fuller's earth, a type of clay or finely ground bran or flour, might be dusted into the hair to absorb grease and superficially clean it. These powders could also be scented with herbs to improve the smell. Imagine trying to make your hair look good with what amounts to fancy dirt. It's a testament to their resourcefulness. Herbal rinses were also used to condition and add scent. Rosemary, lavender, chamomile and sage were common choices, brewed into infusions and used as a final rinse after a partial wash, or simply applied to the hair to make it smell better. These might have offered some minor antibacterial or antiparasitic properties, but their primary aim was often cosmetic. Beards were also a significant aspect of male grooming. While less prone to lice than scalp hair, beards still required care. They would be combed, brushed, and sometimes even oiled with scented oils to keep them soft and lustrous. A well-groomed beard was a sign of status and wisdom for many men. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval medical texts offered specific remedies for head lice, including concoctions involving vinegar, mercury, or even strong alcoholic washes, highlighting the desperate measures people would resort to in their constant fight against these pervasive parasites. It's safe to say that some of these cures might have been worse than the problem itself. Historians still argue whether the widespread presence of lice and luster, or lack thereof, was truly accepted as an unavoidable fact of life, or if the constant efforts to combat it, even with rudimentary tools, indicate a deeper societal discomfort with personal parasites. Regardless, the daily reality of hair care in medieval times was intrinsically linked to the battle against invisible and not so invisible pests. It was a constant, intimate struggle to maintain not just appearance, but a modicum of comfort in a world where personal hygiene was a continuous, labour-intensive challenge. Beyond the scalp and the struggle against microscopic hitchhikers, your attention now shifts to the fundamental layer of medieval existence, clothing hygiene, and the often uncomfortable reality of fabric's filth. Imagine wearing the same wool tunic for weeks, perhaps even months, without a thorough wash, accumulating layers of sweat, dirt, and general medieval grime. It's like wearing your camping clothes for a month straight, but without the benefit of modern washing machines or even readily available clean water. You're observing a typical medieval household. The inhabitants are dressed in sturdy, often drab, clothing made from wool or linen. There's no pile of laundry baskets in the corner, no rhythmic hum of a washing machine. Instead, you see garments being shaken out, perhaps beaten with sticks to dislodge dust, or simply aired by hanging them outside. This is the primary method of clothing hygiene for the vast majority, a far cry from the deep clean we expect. For most medieval people, especially the peasantry, washing clothes was a laborious and infrequent task. Wool, a common fabric, was particularly difficult to clean. It absorbed odours and dirt readily, and when wet became heavy, slow-drying and prone to shrinking or felting. Linen, being lighter and smoother, was easier to wash but still required significant effort. This is a mainstream historical fact. Full washing of outer garments was infrequent due to the labour involved and the nature of the fabrics. When clothes were washed, it was often a communal effort, typically by women at a river, stream or well. Lye, made from wood ash, was used as a crude soap, and clothes would be beaten, scrubbed and rinsed. This was a physically demanding chore, not a quick cycle. After washing, clothes would be hung to dry, often in the sun, which offered some natural disinfectant properties. Imagine spending an entire day just to wash a few garments, and then waiting days for them to dry. It puts our modern laundry woes into perspective. For many, especially those who owned only one or two sets of outer garments, a full wash might only happen a few times a year, coinciding with major seasonal changes or festivals. In between, daily clothing hygiene involved airing garments outside to remove odours, brushing off visible dirt, or beating them to dislodge dust and again, any lurking parasites that might have set up home in the fibres. It's like attempting to freshen your clothes by just shaking them really hard and hoping for the best. The concept of clean for outer garments was therefore different. It was less about sterility and more about acceptable levels of visible dirt and odour. A slight smell, a bit of dust, and the general patina of daily life was simply part of the expected state of fabric's filth. This meant that body odours, absorbed into the wool, would inevitably linger, adding to the pervasive medieval scent profile. The social class also played a role. Nobles might have more clothes, allowing for more frequent changes, and certainly had servants to handle the arduous washing process. Their garments might be spot cleaned, aired more often, and perhaps even infused with scents to mask odours. But even for them, the idea of daily changes of outerwear was uncommon. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval sumptuary laws, which dictated what different social classes could wear, indirectly influenced hygiene by limiting the quantity and quality of clothing available to certain groups, thus making frequent changes and washes less feasible. It's like a fashion regulation that forces everyone to buy less, thus washing less. Historians still argue whether the infrequent washing of outer garments contributed significantly to the spread of disease, or if the primary culprits were more direct vectors like rats and fleas. Regardless, the reality of clothing hygiene in medieval times meant a constant negotiation with fabric's filth. It was a testament to the pragmatism of the era, where cleanliness was pursued within the significant constraints of available resources and labour, leading to a sensory experience far removed from our own pristine expectations. From the broad scope of outer garments and their infrequent washes, you now delve into the more intimate layer of medieval dress. Undergarments, those close to the skin fabrics that bore the brunt of daily grime. Imagine a world where your closest layer of clothing, meant to absorb sweat and protect your outer garments, might be your primary defense against pervasive odors and accumulated filth, and its cleaning was a far cry from a daily cycle. It's like wearing a medieval base layer, and it's doing triple duty as a sweatband, a dirt filter, and a very personal air freshener. You're watching a noble, perhaps a lady preparing for the day, or a knight donning his armour. While their outer garments might be elaborate and rich, it's the simple linen shift or braise, loose breeches, they put on first that concerns us. These are your undergarments, and their role in medieval hygiene was profoundly important, even if their cleanliness standards differed greatly from ours. Unlike wool outerwear, which was difficult and time-consuming to wash, linen, or sometimes hemp undergarments, were designed to be washed more frequently. Linen was relatively easy to clean, quick to dry, and became softer with each wash. It was the primary absorbent layer intended to wick away sweat, oil, and dirt from the body, thus protecting the more expensive and difficult to clean outer clothing. This is a mainstream historical fact. Linen undergarments were worn directly against the skin and were washed more frequently than outer garments. For those who could afford it, the ability to change and wash undergarments regularly was a significant marker of cleanliness and status. A wealthy noble might change their linen shirt daily, or at least every few days, while a prosperous merchant might manage a change once a week. Each change meant a fresh layer against the skin, offering a temporary reprieve from accumulated sweat and body odour. It's a bit like having a rotation of medieval athletic wear, designed for absorbency, if not for peak performance. However, frequently is a relative term in the medieval context. For the vast majority of the population, including peasants and urban labourers, owning multiple sets of undergarments was a luxury. They might have only one or two shifts or pairs of braise, meaning they would have to wear one while the other was being washed and dried. Given the labour involved in washing, remember Section 5, the beating and scrubbing at the river, a weekly wash might have been ambitious for many. For some, changes might have been far less frequent, perhaps fortnightly or even monthly. You can almost feel the chafing, persistent dampness, the faint but undeniable scent of accumulated humanity that would cling to these essential layers. It's like living in your workout clothes for days on end, and no amount of air freshener is going to help. When undergarments were washed, the process was still laborious, but easier than for wool. They would be boiled with lye or ash, beaten, scrubbed, and then rinsed thoroughly. The boiling would have provided a good measure of sanitization, killing some bacteria and certainly any lurking lice or nits that might have transferred from the body. The goal was to get them as white as possible, as whiteness was associated with purity and cleanliness. The cleanliness of these close-to-the-skin layers was a direct link to a person's general personal hygiene. While their outer appearance might be maintained with brushing and airing, the true state of their body's daily output would be absorbed by these hidden fabrics. This meant that body odour, while perhaps masked by external perfumes for the wealthy, would be a constant companion for most, emanating from these frequently worn, sometimes minimally cleaned layers. A quirky tidbit is that medieval sumptuary laws, which dictated what people could wear based on social status, often paid less attention to undergarments, allowing for more variation and individual choice. This meant that while an outer tunic might be strictly regulated, the hidden shift beneath could vary in quality and cleanliness, based more purely on personal means and inclination. It's like a secret rebellion of clean underwear in a world of strictly controlled outer fashion. Historians still argue whether the presence of relatively clean linen undergarments significantly improved public health by acting as a barrier against disease transmission, or if the overall lack of sanitation negated much of this benefit. Regardless, the role of undergarments in medieval hygiene was crucial. They were the frontline defence against dirt and sweat, and their close-to-the-skin nature meant their cleanliness, or lack thereof, directly influenced an individual's daily comfort and perceived freshness, even if the modern ideal of crisp, clean underwear every single day was a distant dream. Having delved into the intricacies of personal clothing, your journey now takes a less pleasant, but undeniably crucial turn into the reality of medieval waste management. We're talking about latrine logic and the diverse, often crude, methods of waste disposal. Imagine a world where the concept of indoor plumbing was centuries away, and dealing with human waste was a daily, hands-on and often very smelly challenge. It's like living in a permanent outhouse, but with more steps and significantly less privacy. You're standing near the back of a bustling medieval house, perhaps a modest city dwelling or a farmhouse. The air here carries a distinct, unpleasant tang, sharper than the general background odour. You might see a small, rough wooden shed, or perhaps just a designated corner. This is where nature calls, and how its call is answered reveals a great deal about medieval sanitation, or the lack thereof. For the vast majority of medieval people, human waste disposal was a remarkably unsophisticated affair. There was no widespread system of sewers, no flushing toilets, and certainly no wastewater treatment plants. Instead, solutions range from the rudimentary to the slightly less rudimentary, all relying on direct physical management of excrement. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval waste disposal systems were largely unsophisticated, relying on direct collection and removal, rather than modern plumbing or sewage. In rural areas, and even within the confines of many private homes in towns, the most common method was the simple pit latrine or privy. This was essentially a hole dug in the ground, often covered by a wooden structure or a simple seat. When the pit was full, it would be covered over, and a new one dug elsewhere. It's like a medieval version of a portable toilet, but decidedly less portable and definitely not designed for comfort. The smell, especially in warmer weather, would have been intense, attracting flies and other insects which in turn carried disease. For larger households, manors and castles, more structured latrines, often called garderobes, were common. These were essentially chutes built into the castle walls or projecting outwards, designed to drop waste directly into a cesspit below, a moat, a river, or simply onto the ground outside the castle walls. While seemingly more advanced, these often created new problems. Moats could become stagnant and foul-smelling, rivers could become polluted downstream, and accumulating waste outside walls created fertile breeding grounds for disease. Imagine trying to explain to your medieval self that your castle's convenient toilet system was actually creating a biohazard. For the urban poor, and those without access to even a basic privy, the reality was even grimmer. Waste might be collected in buckets, and then simply thrown into the streets or waterways, contributing significantly to the rampant urban filth. This practice, while condemned by some medieval authorities, was a widespread reality born of necessity and lack of infrastructure. You're navigating streets that are not just dirty but actively disgusting, trying to avoid stepping in something truly unspeakable. The constant accumulation of human waste posed an enormous challenge to medieval hygiene and public health. It attracted vermin, contaminated water sources, and created a pervasive stench that defined many medieval settlements. The connection between this visible filth and invisible disease was not understood, meaning that even the most diligent efforts at personal cleanliness were often undermined by the larger environmental conditions. A quirky tidbit is that in some medieval castles, garderobes were sometimes ventilated directly into the chimneys, theoretically to pull the smell upwards and out, but often resulting in the unpleasant odour simply permeating the living spaces within the castle. It's like trying to air out your bathroom by venting it directly into your living room fireplace. Historians still argue whether the sporadic attempts by medieval authorities to regulate waste disposal, such as issuing edicts against throwing refuse into the streets, were genuinely effective in improving urban cleanliness, or if they were largely unenforceable in the face of population density and lack of infrastructure. Regardless, the various forms of latrine logic and waste disposal in medieval times reveal a pragmatic but often inadequate approach to a fundamental human necessity, creating environmental conditions that were a constant breeding ground for disease and discomfort. From the fixed, often foul, pit latrines and garderobes, your attention now shifts to a more portable, yet equally ubiquitous element of medieval waste management, chamber pots, and their role as nocturnal necessities. Imagine the convenience of a personal toilet right in your bedroom, but then imagine having to empty it every morning, by hand, often out a window or into a nearby gutter. It's like having an indoor toilet, but the flush button is actually a heave-ho out the window. You're in a medieval bedroom, dimly lit by a dying fire. As night falls, and the need arises, a simple ceramic or wooden pot is brought forth from under the bed, or a curtained alcove. This is your chamber pot, an essential item in almost every medieval home, from the humblest peasant dwelling to the grandest castle chamber. Its presence highlights a fundamental aspect of medieval living, the lack of indoor plumbing and the necessity of managing personal waste within the living quarters. For most medieval people, especially after dark when venturing outside to an external latrine could be inconvenient, cold, or even dangerous, the chamber pot was the go-to solution. It offered a practical, albeit temporary, method for dealing with human waste during the night or whenever discretion was desired. This is a mainstream historical fact. Chamber pots were widely used in medieval households for nighttime and private waste disposal. The design of the chamber pot was simple, a vessel, often round or oval, with a handle for easy carrying. Materials range from basic earthenware for the poor to more elaborate glazed pottery, pewter, or even silver for the wealthy. Regardless of material, its function was the same, to collect urine and feces. You can almost feel the cold ceramic against your skin, or hear the distinct splash in the quiet of the night, a sound that was universally understood if not appreciated. It's like having a very low-tech, very personal porta-potty, but one you have to personally dispose of. The real challenge, and the source of much medieval odour, came with the disposal of the chamber pot's contents. In the morning, or perhaps after several uses, someone, usually a servant or a household member, would have the unenviable task of emptying it. In urban areas, this often meant simply tossing the contents out a window, with a cry of "Gardez-l'eau," from the French garde l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, to warn passers-by below. The contents would then join the general filth of the street, contributing to the pervasive smells and unsanitary conditions that defined many medieval towns. Imagine walking down a street and constantly having to dodge human waste falling from above. It adds a new layer of excitement to your morning commute. In more rural settings, the contents might be emptied into a nearby ditch, a garden, for fertiliser if cautious, or a designated dung heap. While seemingly more controlled, these methods still contributed to environmental contamination and attracted flies and other disease vectors. Even in castles with dedicated guardrobes, as discussed in Section 7, chamber pots were often used for convenience, with their contents then emptied down the chute. The pervasive use of chamber pots and their often haphazard disposal directly contributed to the unsanitary conditions of medieval urban life. They were a necessary evil, providing personal convenience at the cost of broader public health. The constant presence of human waste, both indoors and then outdoors, meant that medieval people lived in an environment saturated with potential pathogens, even if they didn't understand the invisible link between filth and disease. A quirky tidbit is that some illuminated manuscripts depict humorous or satirical scenes of chamber pot use and disposal, suggesting that while a practical necessity, the act itself was often viewed with a mix of resignation, humour, and a certain amount of disgust. It's like medieval internet memes about toilet humour, but less shareable and more literal. Historians still argue whether the common practice of emptying chamber pots into the streets was a primary driver of urban epidemics, or if it was merely one contributing factor among many, such as contaminated water sources and rampant vermin. Regardless, the daily reality of chamber pots as nocturnal necessities highlights the fundamental challenges of hygiene in a world without modern plumbing. They were a symbol of both personal convenience and public health compromise, defining a pervasive aspect of medieval life and contributing significantly to the era's unique sensory landscape. From the private yet still problematic chamber pots of individual homes, your journey now expands to the communal facilities that served medieval towns, public privies, and the sheer scale of urban odours they contributed. Imagine a designated building, often a simple wooden structure over a cesspit or river, where many people would gather to relieve themselves, creating a concentrated source of the medieval smellscape. It's like a permanent medieval porta-potty convention, but with a lot more flies and a much stronger aroma. You're standing near the edge of a medieval town, perhaps by a river or a bustling market square. A particularly strong, pervasive stench assaults your senses, a smell that clings to the air, distinct from the general background of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Your gaze follows your nose to a rickety wooden structure, perhaps multiple holes cut into benches, or a series of stalls with no doors. This is a public privy, and its presence is a testament to the challenges of managing human waste in a densely populated urban environment without modern infrastructure. Public privies were a common feature in larger towns and cities, providing a communal solution for those who didn't have access to private latrines, like the guardrabes in castles discussed in Section 7, or who simply didn't want to use their chamber pots from Section 8 during the day. These facilities were often located near waterways, allowing waste to be carried away by the current or over large cesspits that would be periodically emptied. This is a mainstream historical fact. Public privies were common in medieval towns and cities, serving communal waste disposal needs. While providing a necessary service, these public privies were monumental sources of urban odours. The sheer volume of waste concentrated in one area, combined with a lack of proper ventilation or flushing mechanisms, meant that the smell was constant and overwhelming. Imagine an open-air toilet that hundreds of people use daily. It's an olfactory assault that no amount of medieval perfume could mask. The accumulated waste would attract flies, rats, and other vermin, creating significant public health hazards, even if the direct link to disease wasn't understood. The design of these privies varied. Some might be simple multi-hole benches over a ditch, while others were more elaborate structures built over rivers or large pits. Despite their functional purpose, they were rarely designed for comfort or privacy. Modesty was a very different concept in medieval times, and the communal nature of these facilities underscored a pragmatic approach to bodily functions. You're rubbing shoulders with strangers as you attend to nature's call, and the lingering scent serves as a constant reminder of the communal experience. The management of these public facilities was often haphazard. While some towns might employ labourers to periodically clean out cesspits or maintain the structures, the sheer volume of waste and the lack of sanitation technology meant that they were almost perpetually overflowing or simply foul. The waste that flowed into rivers also contributed to the pollution of water sources used for drinking and bathing downstream, creating a dangerous cycle of contamination. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval cities even built necessity houses directly into city bridges, with chutes dropping waste straight into the river below. While convenient, this certainly contributed to the pollution of the waterways that were often the primary source of drinking water for downstream communities. It's like building a giant toilet right on top of your drinking fountain. Historians still argue whether the presence of public privies, despite their foulness, was ultimately a net positive for urban hygiene by concentrating waste in specific areas, or if their inherent unsanitary nature contributed more significantly to disease transmission than individual more dispersed methods. Regardless, the public privies were undeniable landmarks of medieval urban odours. They represented a pragmatic, albeit deeply problematic, attempt to manage human waste in densely populated areas, creating environmental conditions that were a constant challenge to public health and a defining sensory experience of medieval town life. From the concentrated effluvium of public privies, your gaze now drops directly to the ground beneath your feet, where street sanitation faced the monumental challenge of urban filth. Imagine medieval streets, not just unpaved, but serving as open sewers, rubbish dumps and animal pens all at once, creating a pervasive layer of grime that defined city life. It's like navigating a permanent mud wrestling match, but the mud is made of truly questionable ingredients. You're walking through a narrow, winding street in a bustling medieval town. The ground is uneven, a mix of compacted earth, scattered straw, and something wet and squishy underfoot. The air is thick with a generalised, inescapable odour, a blend of stale food, unwashed humanity, and animal waste. This is the reality of medieval street sanitation, a constant losing battle against urban filth that permeated every aspect of daily life. Medieval streets were far from the neatly paved and cleaned thoroughfares we know today. Most were unpaved, turning into muddy quagmires in wet weather and dusty, foul-smelling tracks when dry. They served multiple purposes, as transportation routes, marketplaces, and crucially as the de facto waste disposal system for much of the population. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval urban streets were typically unpaved and served as primary receptacles for various forms of waste. The contents of chamber pots, remember Section 8, were frequently tossed from windows directly onto the streets, adding human waste to the mix. Animal droppings from horses, pigs, chickens, and even sheep, which often roamed freely within urban areas, further contributed to the pervasive mess. Butcher's offal, household food scraps, discarded ash from fires, and industrial waste from various crafts, like tanning or dyeing, were routinely dumped directly into the streets or just outside houses. Imagine a municipal waste service that consists entirely of gravity and hope. It's like living in a giant open-air compost heap, but with significantly less appealing smells and a lot more raw sewage. The sheer volume of refuse meant that medieval streets were perpetually coated in a thick layer of muck. While some towns might have had rudimentary systems for cleaning, such as rakers or gong firmers, who periodically collected waste, their efforts were often overwhelmed by the constant influx. Rain, rather than cleaning the streets, often just washed the filth into gutters and then into rivers or stagnant ditches, further spreading contamination. You're trying to avoid stepping in something truly disgusting with every stride, a continuous low-level anxiety that modern urban dwellers rarely experience. This rampant urban filth had profound public health implications. The decaying organic matter attracted swarms of flies, which then carried pathogens directly onto food and into homes. Rats, thriving in the abundant refuse, became major vectors for diseases like the plague, which we'll discuss later. Contaminated street surfaces meant that even contact with the ground could pose a health risk, especially for those without adequate footwear. The pervasive odours were not just an annoyance, they were a constant sensory reminder of the unsanitary conditions. While medieval noses might have adapted to some extent, truly putrid smells would have been universally recognised as unpleasant and unhealthy. The concept of pleasant fresh air was a rarity in most medieval towns, replaced by a complex, often offensive, olfactory landscape. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval towns actually passed ordinances prohibiting people from throwing waste into the streets during certain hours, or specifying designated dumping spots, demonstrating a nascent, though often ineffective, awareness of public health concerns. It's like having city regulations against littering, but the only enforcement is a stern frown from the local mayor. Historians still argue whether the lack of effective street sanitation was primarily due to a fundamental ignorance of disease transmission, or if it was more a consequence of the immense practical and financial challenges of urban waste management in a pre-industrial era. Regardless, the constant presence of urban filth on medieval streets was an undeniable aspect of daily life, shaping the sensory experience, contributing to public health crises, and offering a stark contrast to our modern expectations of clean, walkable urban environments. Beyond the everyday human waste and general rubbish, your journey through medieval urban environments now highlights another pervasive source of grime: animal waste and the sheer beast's burden it imposed on cleanliness. Imagine stepping out your door into a street not just shared with other humans, but with horses, pigs, chickens and dogs, all contributing their biological output to the communal ground. It's like living in a permanent petting zoo that doubles as a toilet. You're navigating a medieval street, perhaps trying to get to the market. The ground isn't just mud and scattered straw, it's crisscrossed with fresh and dried droppings from various animals. The air carries the distinct sharp tang of manure, mingling with the other urban odours, which we discussed in section 9 and 10. This pervasive presence of animal waste was an inescapable reality of medieval life, creating a constant challenge for hygiene and public health. Animals were integral to medieval society. Horses were essential for transportation and labour. Cattle, pigs and sheep were raised for food and materials, often kept within or just outside urban centres. Chickens and other fowl roamed freely, providing eggs and meat, and, of course, dogs were common companions and working animals. All of these creatures, by their very nature, produced waste, and with limited systems for collection and disposal, much of it ended up on the streets. This is a mainstream historical fact. Animal waste was a pervasive problem in medieval towns due to the close proximity of people and livestock. The sheer volume of excrement was staggering. Imagine a town with hundreds of horses, each producing pounds of manure daily. Add to that the droppings from cattle being driven to market, the pigs rooting in gutters, and the constant output from chickens and other fowl. The result was a thick, ever-present layer of filth that mixed with rainwater to form a foul-smelling, disease-laden sludge. You're trying to keep your boots clean, but it's a futile effort in a landscape designed for constant resoiling. It's like trying to keep a white shirt pristine while working in a very messy farm. Impossible. This beast's burden had significant public health implications. Animal waste attracted swarms of flies, which then carried pathogens from the manure directly onto human food and into homes. It also provided a rich breeding ground for bacteria and contributed to the overall contamination of the urban environment. While medieval people didn't understand germ theory, they certainly recognised that filth attracted disease, and animal waste was a major contributor to that filth. Beyond the streets, animal waste also accumulated in stables, farmyards, and areas where livestock were kept within or on the outskirts of towns. While some of this manure would be collected for fertilizer, a significant amount would remain, contributing to local odours and pest problems. The constant presence of animals in close proximity to human dwellings meant that the line between clean and unclean environments was perpetually blurred. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval towns actually employed dung farmers, or scavengers, whose job it was to collect animal manure from the streets and sell it as fertilizer, indicating a pragmatic approach to turning a nuisance into a resource. It's like a medieval recycling program, but it's primarily focused on poop. Historians still argue whether the close proximity of humans and animals in medieval towns, and the resulting animal waste, was a primary driver of urban disease, or if factors like contaminated water and poor human waste disposal were more significant. Regardless, the constant presence of beasts' burden in medieval streets was an undeniable aspect of daily life. It shaped the sensory experience, contributed significantly to the pervasive urban filth, which we discussed in Section 10, and highlighted the continuous challenges of maintaining any semblance of cleanliness in a pre-industrial world. Having navigated the visible filth of human and animal waste on the streets, your journey into medieval sanitation now broadens to encompass waste disposal of all kinds, focusing on the pervasive issue of general rubbish. Imagine a world where every household produced waste, but there was no organised collection, no landfills, and certainly no recycling programs. Instead, discarded items piled up, decomposed, and contributed to an unending cycle of grime and odour. It's like living in a perpetual yard sale that also doubles as a dumpster, and nothing ever gets hauled away. You're observing a typical medieval dwelling, perhaps a craftsman's workshop or a small peasant home. Every day materials are used, food is prepared, and remnants are created. There are no neat bins, no municipal services for waste pickup. Instead, you might see scraps casually tossed out the door, or a small pile accumulating in a corner of a yard, eventually finding its way into the street or a nearby ditch. This haphazard approach to waste disposal meant that general rubbish was a constant, unsightly, and unsanitary feature of the medieval landscape. The types of general rubbish were diverse. Food scraps, such as bones, vegetable peelings, and stale bread, were common. These would quickly rot, attracting flies and vermin and producing foul odours. Ash from hearths and fires was another ubiquitous waste product. While sometimes used as fertiliser or for making lye, large quantities would often just be dumped. Discarded pottery shards, broken tools, worn-out textiles, and waste from various crafts, like leather offcuts from shoemakers, wood shavings from carpenters, or even the remnants of animal processing from butchers, all contributed to the ever-growing piles. This is a mainstream historical fact. General household and craft waste was typically disposed of informally, often by dumping it into streets or open areas. Without organised municipal waste collection, individual households and businesses were largely responsible for their own refuse. As we've seen, this often meant simply casting it into the street to mingle with human and animal waste. Recall sections 10 and 11. For some, particularly in rural areas, designated middens or dung heaps outside their homes might collect various forms of organic waste for eventual use as fertiliser. But even these would be unmanaged, attracting pests and creating local nuisances. The sheer volume of this unmanaged general rubbish created an environment ripe for disease. Piles of decaying organic matter served as ideal breeding grounds for rats, mice, and insects, which then carried pathogens. Water sources could become contaminated by runoff from these dumps. The pervasive smell, while perhaps somewhat normalised for medieval noses, would have been a constant reminder of the unsanitary conditions. You can almost feel the crunch of refuse underfoot, the slippery sensation of rotting food, and the buzzing of flies that accompanied every step. It's like having a picnic in a landfill, and everyone brought their own rotten leftovers. Despite the obvious problems, widespread systematic waste collection was a concept that simply didn't exist in medieval times. The infrastructure, the understanding of public health, and the financial resources were all lacking. While some towns might occasionally organise large cleanups, these were temporary measures, and the flow of refuse was relentless. A quirky tidbit is that medieval chroniclers sometimes describe instances of severe blockages in city ditches and moats due to the sheer volume of accumulated waste, leading to even worse flooding and foul odours, highlighting the systemic failure of informal disposal methods. It's like your drain constantly backing up, because you're using it as a trash compactor. Historians still argue whether the primary concern regarding general rubbish was its aesthetic impact and foul odour, or if medieval authorities truly understood its link to disease propagation, and thus actively sought its removal for health reasons. Regardless, the informal approach to waste disposal meant that general rubbish was a ubiquitous and problematic feature of medieval life. It contributed significantly to the pervasive filth of the era, creating an environment that was perpetually ripe for contamination and discomfort. Having endured the omnipresent filth of medieval land-based waste, your focus now shifts to a more fundamental element of survival: water sources, and the perpetual purities quest that defined their use. Imagine a world where every drink you took, every bucket of water you drew, carried an invisible risk, a silent gamble with your health, because the very liquid of life was often teeming with unseen dangers. It's like living with a permanent game of Russian roulette every time you filled a cup, but instead of a bullet, it's a stomach bug. You're standing near a bustling river, perhaps a small stream, or beside a public well in the heart of a village. People are gathered, filling pitchers, washing clothes, watering animals. The scene seems idyllic at first glance, but the reality beneath the surface, or rather in the surface, is far from pristine. This ubiquitous dependence on varied water sources meant that the purities quest for clean, safe water was a constant, often unsuccessful battle for medieval communities. The primary water sources for medieval populations were rivers, streams, lakes, and most importantly, wells. In rural areas, a village might rely on a local stream or a few communal wells. In towns, access to water was more complex. Rivers often flowed through populated areas, receiving runoff from streets, waste from tanneries and butchers, and the direct discharge from public privies, remember section 9, and chamber pots, from section 8. This made river water, despite its visual appeal, a highly questionable source for drinking. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval urban populations often relied on rivers and wells, which were frequently contaminated. Wells, whether private or communal, offered a seemingly safer alternative, drawing water from underground aquifers. However, even wells were vulnerable. If located too close to cesspits, burial grounds, or areas of high animal concentration, like those contributing to beasts' burden from section 11, they could easily become contaminated by seepage. The water might look clear, but unseen pathogens could lurk within, waiting to cause illness. You can almost feel the instinctive hesitation before taking a deep drink. A subconscious awareness that clear doesn't always mean clean. Is like being offered a pristine-looking glass of water that you suspect might have just been scooped from a puddle. The concept of clean water in the medieval mind was largely based on sensory perception. Did it look clear? Did it smell fresh? Did it taste palatable? Without scientific understanding of microorganisms, they had no way to detect invisible contaminants. Their purities quest was therefore primarily focused on aesthetic and olfactory qualities, which were often misleading. For drinking, people might try to improve water quality through simple methods. Boiling water, though labour-intensive and costly in terms of fuel, would have killed many pathogens, but this was generally reserved for preparing food or specific beverages like ale or gruel, not for daily drinking water. Filtering through cloth, while removing visible particulates, would have done little for microbial contamination. The widespread consumption of weaker alcoholic beverages like ale or cider, often preferred over water, was partly due to the fact that the brewing process, which involved boiling, made them safer to drink. It's like opting for a slightly tipsy state just to avoid a tummy ache. The constant threat of waterborne diseases such as dysentery, cholera and typhoid was a grim reality. These diseases could decimate populations, and their link to contaminated water, while not fully understood, was sometimes intuitively recognised through experience. When a well or river seemed to cause illness, people might seek alternative sources, but often the alternatives were no better. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval towns, particularly those founded by Roman influence, attempted to maintain rudimentary aqueducts or conduits to bring water from more distant, supposedly cleaner sources outside the city walls. However, maintaining these structures was a constant challenge, and their effectiveness could be compromised by damage or infiltration. It's like having a very slow, leaky garden hose that brings water from a distant, slightly cleaner puddle. Historians still argue whether the consumption of alcohol, ale, cider, wine, by all ages and classes in medieval society, was primarily a nutritional choice, a social custom, or a deliberate hygienic strategy to avoid contaminated water. Regardless, the constant reliance on vulnerable water sources meant that the purity's quest for safe drinking water was a fundamental and often perilous challenge for medieval people. It shaped their daily habits, influenced their dietary choices, and placed them in constant proximity to unseen dangers. From the general challenges of securing clean water sources, your journey now focuses on a specific and highly prevalent one, well water, and the constant dance between risk and reward it presented. Imagine drawing what appeared to be clear, cool water from the earth, believing it pure yet unknowingly pulling up a potential cocktail of unseen dangers alongside its refreshing promise. It's like finding a hidden spring, but it might also be a secret toxic waste dump, and you won't know until you're already sick. You're standing by a communal well, its stone sides worn smooth by centuries of hands, its wooden bucket creaking as it descends into the dark depths. Villagers are queuing patiently, their pitchers and buckets ready. This act, so simple and essential, is a daily ritual for most medieval communities. But beneath the surface, literally, the reliance on well water brought with it an inherent risk and reward that medieval people navigated without modern scientific understanding. Wells tapped into underground aquifers, offering a seemingly cleaner alternative to surface water from rivers or streams, which were often visibly polluted. The earth itself acted as a natural filter, often clarifying the water. This meant that well water was generally preferred for drinking and cooking, as it often looked and tasted better. This is a mainstream historical fact. Wells were a primary and often preferred source of drinking water in medieval communities. However, the reward of seemingly clean water came with significant risk. While visually clearer, well water was highly susceptible to contamination from various sources. If a well was dug too close to a cesspit, a grave, an animal pen, contributing to beast's burden from section 11, or areas where general rubbish, from section 12, accumulated, pathogens from decomposing organic matter could seep through the soil and into the groundwater. The water might remain crystal clear, yet be teeming with bacteria and viruses capable of causing dysentery, typhoid, and other devastating illnesses. You can almost feel the phantom tickle of unseen microbes in your throat as you take a simulated drink, a chilling reminder of invisible threats. It's like a secret villain in your drink disguised as pure refreshment. The depth of the well also played a role. Deeper wells generally offered better protection against surface contamination, but digging them was more laborious and costly. Shallower wells, while easier to construct, were far more vulnerable to localized pollution. For many medieval communities, the practicality of digging a shallower, more accessible well often outweighed the unperceived long-term health risks. Furthermore, the very act of drawing water could introduce contamination. Shared buckets, ropes and hands could transfer dirt and germs into the well. Animals might drink directly from the wellhead, or their waste could be washed into it by rain. The constant human and animal activity around a communal well made it a potential focal point for disease transmission, even if the water itself originated from a clean aquifer. A quirky tidbit is that in some monastic communities, where hygiene was often more rigorously observed, wells might be specifically located far from latrines and animal enclosures, and rules might be in place for their maintenance and cleanliness, reflecting an intuitive understanding of preventing contamination. It's like an early unscientific form of environmental impact assessment, driven by common sense rather than scientific data. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates from waterborne diseases in medieval times were primarily due to widespread contamination of well water, or if they were more a consequence of the overall unsanitary environment, including urban filth from Section 10, and lack of medical understanding. Regardless, the reliance on well water meant that medieval people were constantly engaging in a dance of risk and reward. The seemingly pure liquid they drew from the earth, while essential for survival, was often a hidden vector for illness, underscoring the profound challenges of securing truly safe drinking water in an era without modern sanitation or scientific knowledge. Beyond the individual efforts at cleanliness and the challenges of water sourcing, your journey now enters a realm where hygiene, commerce and social life often intertwined. Public baths, and the complex reality of communal cleansing. Imagine stepping into a large, bustling hall filled with steam, the murmur of voices and the distinct scent of warm water and bodies, where bathing was a shared experience, not a solitary one. It's like a medieval public swimming pool, but for washing, and with a significantly less strict dress code. You're standing at the entrance to a bathhouse, perhaps in a bustling medieval town or a larger city. The air is thick with humidity, and a peculiar blend of scents, a mix of human bodies, herbal infusions and lingering steam. You hear the splashing of water, the chatter of voices, and perhaps even the strumming of a lute. This lively atmosphere is your first hint that public baths were much more than just places to get clean. They were vital social hubs, offering a unique form of communal cleansing. Public bathhouses, often called stews in England, not to be confused with the food, or étuves in France, were common across medieval Europe, particularly in urban centres. They provided facilities for full-body washing that were often unavailable in private homes due to the cost and labour of heating large quantities of water. These establishments range from simple, clean operations to more luxurious affairs, offering hot baths, steam rooms, and sometimes even massages or barber services. This is a mainstream historical fact. Public bathhouses were a feature of medieval urban life, providing bathing facilities for a fee. The experience of communal cleansing was just that, communal. You wouldn't have a private cubicle with a lock. Instead, people would bathe together in large tubs or pools, often segregated by gender, though not always rigidly. The shared nature of the experience fostered social interaction. People would chat, conduct business, gossip, and even eat while bathing. It's like a medieval equivalent of a coffee shop, but everyone's in a tub. This social aspect meant that cleanliness was intertwined with community, a shared experience of purification, however imperfect. However, the very communal nature of these baths also brought challenges to hygiene. The same water would be used by many people, and while it might be refreshed, it was rarely completely changed for each new bather. This meant the water could quickly become murky and potentially contaminated, especially without a scientific understanding of germ transmission. Imagine sharing bathwater with a dozen strangers. It puts a different spin on clean. As the medieval period progressed, particularly after the devastating plagues, the popularity of public baths began to decline in some regions. This decline is a subject of historical debate, but factors like changing social customs, a growing association of bathhouses with immorality, as some also served as brothels, and a nascent fear of disease transmission through shared water likely played a role. The initial Roman legacy of communal bathing, once widespread, gradually faded in many areas. A quirky tidbit is that some public bathhouses even offered musical entertainment or food and drink services, turning the act of bathing into a full sensory and social event. You could literally soak, snack, and socialise all at once. It's like a medieval spa party, but with a higher chance of catching something besides relaxation. Historians still argue whether the decline of public baths was primarily due to increased awareness of disease transmission, a shift in moral attitudes, or economic factors that made them less viable. Regardless, the existence of public baths for communal cleansing reveals a fascinating tension in medieval hygiene. They were essential for providing bathing opportunities, fostering social interaction, and offering a form of cleanliness. Yet their very communal nature, combined with a lack of germ theory, meant they also presented potential risks, painting a complex picture of medieval attempts at broader sanitation. From the social, steamy world of public baths, your journey now shifts to a more personal and often more pleasant approach to combating medieval odours, herbal remedies, and the refreshing power of natural fresheners. Imagine a world where instead of chemical sprays, people relied on the bounty of gardens and forests to make their surroundings, and themselves, smell a little less like, well, medieval times. It's like aromatherapy, but with higher stakes and a lot more immediate need. You're in a quiet courtyard, perhaps a monastery garden or a noble lady's private herb patch. The air here is surprisingly pleasant, carrying the sweet scent of lavender, the sharp tang of rosemary, and the earthy notes of mint. You watch as leaves are plucked, crushed, and perhaps steeped in hot water. This meticulous care for herbal remedies underscores a deep intuitive understanding of nature's ability to provide natural fresheners in a world perpetually battling pervasive smells. Medieval people, lacking modern deodorizers and sanitation, relied heavily on plants for both their perceived medicinal benefits and their aromatic qualities. Herbs were woven into garlands, strewn on floors, stuffed into sachets, and used to infuse water for washing. The goal was to mask unpleasant odours, deter pests, and create a more agreeable sensory environment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Herbs were widely used in medieval times for their aromatic properties to combat unpleasant odours. Common herbs used for their scent included lavender, known for its calming and sweet floral aroma. It was often used in washing water, sachets, and to scent linen. Imagine the subtle, soothing scent of lavender wafting from freshly aired clothes, a stark contrast to the general medieval funk. Rosemary. With its woody, pine-like scent, rosemary was valued for its invigorating properties and often used in baths and as a strewing herb. Mint, various types. Peppermint, spearmint, and other varieties offered a sharp, refreshing aroma, useful for freshening rooms and even as a chewing herb for bad breath, as we briefly touched upon in section 3. Sage. Valued for its earthy, slightly peppery scent, sage was believed to have cleansing properties and was also used in remedies. Chamomile. Its sweet, apple-like scent made it a popular choice for infusing washing water and for its calming effects. Thyme, a robust, earthy herb used for both culinary and aromatic purposes, often strewn on floors. These natural fresheners were employed in various ways. Strewing herbs were literally scattered on the floors of homes, churches, and public buildings. As people walked over them, the herbs would be crushed, releasing their volatile oils and providing a temporary burst of pleasant scent. This also helped to deter fleas and other insects which disliked certain strong herbal aromas. It's like having a medieval air freshener that you literally walked all over, and it also acted as a bug repellent. Herbs were also used to create scented waters for hand washing. Remember section 2, for rinsing hair, as discussed in section 4, and for adding to bath water from section 1 and 15. These infusions provided a pleasant scent and might have had mild antiseptic properties. Small sachets or pomanders filled with dried herbs and spices, like cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg, were carried on the person, or placed among clothes to impart a fragrant aroma and ward off unpleasant smells. Imagine carrying a small, fragrant pouch under your nose throughout the day, your personal shield against the prevailing medieval scents. For particularly foul areas, like latrines or sick rooms, stronger smelling herbs and resins, sometimes burned as incense, would be employed to try and overpower the more offensive odours. This was a pragmatic approach. If you can't eliminate the source of the smell, at least try to mask it. A quirky tidbit is that medieval recipe books sometimes contained elaborate instructions for creating sweet waters, or perfume waters, using distilled flower petals and herbs, showcasing a sophisticated, if rudimentary, understanding of botanical extraction for aromatic purposes. It's like a medieval version of a DIY essential oil workshop, but with less fancy equipment and more trial and error. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for using herbal remedies for scent was purely aesthetic and to mask bad odours, or if medieval people genuinely believed in their unseen properties to purify the air and ward off miasma, the belief that bad air caused disease. Regardless, the pervasive use of natural fresheners from gardens and wild growth highlights a resourceful and continuous effort to combat the overwhelming sensory realities of medieval life, making them an indispensable part of daily hygiene and comfort. From the subtle waft of herbal remedies, your journey now leads to a more concentrated and often more extravagant attempt to manage the medieval smellscape. Perfumes and scent used deliberately for masking odours. Imagine a noble lady, not just smelling faintly of lavender, but enveloped in a cloud of musk, civet or ambergris, an expensive, powerful shield against the pervasive background of less pleasant smells. It's like wearing a medieval air freshener dispenser, but it's made of exotic animal secretions and costs a fortune. You're in a grand hall, perhaps at a courtly gathering or a feast. The general aroma of the room is still complex, a mix of roasted meats, stale ale and unwashed bodies, but every so often, a strong, rich, almost overwhelming fragrance cuts through the air. This powerful presence is your clue that perfumes and scent were not just about smelling nice. They were a strategic tool for masking odours, a form of personal defence against the medieval environment. Unlike the simple natural fresheners from section 16 found in gardens, these perfumes and scent were often exotic and expensive, imported from the East. They were typically based on animal-derived ingredients like Musk, a strong, earthy, somewhat sweet scent extracted from the glands of the musk deer. Civet, a pungent, fecal-smelling secretion from the civet cat, which when highly diluted becomes surprisingly floral and sensual. Ambergris, a waxy substance formed in the digestive system of sperm whales, often found floating in the ocean, possessing a unique, sweet, earthy and marine scent. These substances, along with highly concentrated floral oils like rose or jasmine, and spices like cloves or cinnamon, were mixed with alcohol or oils to create potent fragrances. They were generally not applied directly to the skin in large quantities, but rather to clothing, hair, as mentioned in section 4, or kept in small perforated containers called pomanders, which could be sniffed throughout the day. This is a mainstream historical fact. Expensive, animal-derived perfumes were used by the wealthy in medieval times to mask body and environmental odours. The use of these strong perfumes and scent was largely a prerogative of the wealthy and aristocratic classes. For them, it was a display of status and a practical necessity, when daily full-body bathing, as discussed in section 1, was infrequent, and the pervasive urban odours, from section 9, were inescapable. A powerful perfume provided a personal aromatic bubble. It's like having a very fancy, very personal force field against bad smells, and its main component is whale vomit. The purpose was clearly masking odours. These perfumes weren't about creating a light, fresh aura. They were designed to overpower and conceal the less pleasant smells that clung to clothing. Remember fabric's filth from section 5, bodies and environments. The stronger the perfume, the more effective it was at cutting through the general medieval scent profile. This preference for heavy, often musky or animalic notes tells you a lot about the olfactory challenges of the era. Beyond personal application, these expensive scents might also be used to perfume gloves, bed linens, or even entire rooms, albeit sparingly. The idea was to create pockets of agreeable smell in a world that generally wasn't. A quirky tidbit is that medieval sumptuary laws sometimes even dictated the types and quantities of perfumes that different social classes could use, reflecting not just their cost but their role as potent symbols of wealth and social distinction. It's like a law that says you can only afford to smell this good if you're rich enough to own a private jet. Historians still argue whether the extensive use of strong perfumes and scent by the elite truly improved their perceived personal hygiene, or if it merely highlighted the underlying lack of cleanliness by attempting to cover it up rather than address it. Regardless, the deliberate strategy of masking odours with potent and expensive fragrances reveals a continuous effort by medieval elites to create a more pleasant personal environment in a world constantly battling pervasive smells. It underscores a pragmatic, if somewhat superficial, approach to hygiene in an era without modern sanitation. From the aromatic attempts to mask unpleasant smells, your journey now moves to a more direct and often painful interface between medieval hygiene and basic healthcare, barber surgeons, and their dual role in cuts and cures. Imagine a figure, part hairstylist, part dentist, part minor surgeon, ready to offer a shave, pull a tooth, or even bleed you, all within the confines of a single, often less than sterile establishment. It's like getting your hair cut, your wisdom teeth removed, and a small medical procedure all in one trip to the local strip mall. But the strip mall is medieval, and the tools are a bit rustier. You're in a bustling medieval town, and your eyes fall upon a shop marked by a distinctive pole, often red and white, symbolising blood and bandages. Inside you see a barber tending to a customer's beard, but also perhaps a tooth being extracted, or a small incision being made. This is the domain of the barber surgeon, a common and indispensable figure in medieval life, whose services encompassed a surprising range of personal grooming and minor medical procedures, often with dubious hygienic standards. This is a mainstream historical fact. Barber surgeons performed both grooming and minor medical procedures in medieval times. The role of the barber surgeon was diverse. Their primary functions, from which they derived their name, were hair cutting, shaving, and beard trimming. These were essential grooming services, especially for men, to maintain a respectable appearance. You can almost feel the cold steel of the razor against your neck, the slight tug as stray hairs are removed, a moment of fleeting cleanliness in a generally unkempt world. It's a bit like getting a medieval spa treatment, but with a sharper blade and a higher chance of a nick. However, their duties extended far beyond mere aesthetics. With limited numbers of university-trained physicians, barber surgeons filled a crucial gap in basic medical care. They performed a range of minor surgical procedures, including tooth extractions, a common ailment, and the barber surgeon was often the one to pull an aching tooth. Bloodletting, a widely practiced medical theory believed to balance the body's humours and treat various illnesses, a concept we'll explore further in section 19. Setting broken bones, simple fractures might be managed by them. Lancing boils and abscesses, draining infections was a common if painful task. Minor wound care, cleaning and dressing small cuts and gashes. The hygienic conditions in a barber surgeon's shop were, by modern standards, appalling. Tools were rarely sterilised, often just wiped clean, if at all, between uses. This meant that the same razor or bleeding lancet might be used on multiple patients, potentially spreading infections. While they might have used some rudimentary antiseptics like wine or vinegar for wound cleaning, their understanding of microbial infection was non-existent. You can almost smell the faint scent of stale blood, the metallic tang mingling with the scent of unwashed bodies, and perhaps some herbal liniments. It's like a medieval version of a multi-purpose tool, but the tool is rarely cleaned, and it's being used for everything from hair trims to amateur surgery. Despite these significant hygiene challenges, barber surgeons were often the most accessible form of medical attention for the common person. They were practical, often more affordable than a physician, and provided immediate care for common complaints. Their presence highlights the pragmatic, if sometimes risky, approach to health and personal care in medieval society. A quirky tidbit is that the red and white striped pole outside a barber surgeon's shop is thought to symbolise the blood and bandages associated with their practice, making it a surprisingly graphic, yet universally understood form of medieval advertising. It's like a medieval fast food joint advertising its main dish, with a picture of a cow being butchered. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of bloodletting by barber surgeons, despite its unscientific basis, sometimes offered psychological benefits to patients who believed it was curing them, or if it was almost always detrimental due to the risks of infection and weakening the patient. Regardless, the barber surgeons were essential figures in medieval society, providing a blend of personal grooming and basic health care. Their practice of cuts and cures offered a fascinating and often unhygienic glimpse into the pragmatic realities of medieval hygiene and rudimentary medical care. From the direct, often bloody interventions of the barber surgeons, your journey into medieval hygiene now delves into the underlying theoretical framework that guided much of their practice: medical theory, specifically the pervasive concept of humoral imbalance. Imagine a world where illness wasn't understood as being caused by invisible germs, but by an internal disharmony of 4 fundamental bodily fluids, and hygiene practices were often shaped by attempts to restore this delicate balance. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by rearranging the furniture in your living room. You're doing something, but it's probably not addressing the real problem. You're in the quiet, studious atmosphere of a medieval physician's room, not a bustling surgery. On a desk you see ancient texts, perhaps diagrams of the human body and charts relating to the stars and seasons. The air is tinged with the scent of dried herbs and parchment. This intellectual space is where medical theory shaped daily practices, including those related to hygiene, through the dominant lens of humoral imbalance. The prevailing medical belief in medieval Europe, inherited largely from ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, was the theory of humours. This theory posited that the human body contained 4 primary fluids, or humours: blood, associated with air, spring, hot and moist; phlegm, associated with water, winter, cold and moist; yellow bile, or choler, associated with fire, summer, hot and dry; black bile, or melancholy, associated with earth, autumn, cold and dry. Good health was believed to result from a perfect balance of these humours. Illness, conversely, was a consequence of an imbalance, too much of one humour or too little. This is a mainstream historical fact. The humoral theory of medicine was the dominant medical paradigm in medieval Europe. This belief system profoundly influenced hygiene practices. For instance, bloodletting, a practice of the barber surgeons, remember from section 18, was commonly performed to reduce an excess of blood. Sweating, purging, vomiting or defecating, and even specific dietary recommendations were all aimed at expelling bad humours or restoring balance. A dirty body, for example, might be seen as holding on to excess humours, or conversely, excessive cleanliness, like too much bathing as we saw in section 1, might be thought to open pores and allow humours to escape too easily. making one vulnerable to cold and disease. It's like a medieval nutritionist telling you to eat more kale to balance your internal fire. The intent is good, but the underlying science is a bit off. The purpose of various hygiene routines, from the perspective of humoral imbalance, was not primarily to kill germs, as they were unknown, but to maintain the body's internal equilibrium. For example, fresh air was considered important to avoid bad air or miasma, a concept we'll touch on again later, which could affect the humours. Regular bowel movements were seen as essential for expelling waste humours, contributing to the daily importance of latrine logic, from section 7, and chamber pots, from section 8. Personal scent and body odour were also interpreted through the humoral lens. Certain smells might be associated with an excess of a particular humour. Masking these odours with perfumes and scent, from section 17, wasn't just about pleasantness, but perhaps also an attempt to influence or counteract the perceived humoral imbalance. A quirky tidbit is that specific foods were categorised by their humoral qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and dietary advice for maintaining balance was given, sometimes recommending certain vegetables or meats based on the season or an individual's perceived humoral constitution. So, your medieval doctor might prescribe a cold cucumber if you had too much hot yellow bile. Historians still argue whether the practical outcomes of humoral medicine, despite its flawed theoretical basis, sometimes serendipitously led to beneficial hygienic practices, e.g., encouraging fresh air or avoiding stagnant water, or if its adherence largely hindered the development of truly effective sanitation. Regardless, the pervasive medical theory of humoral imbalance significantly shaped how medieval people understood their bodies and their environment. It influenced their approaches to health, illness and hygiene, framing practices not around germ theory, but around the complex and ever-shifting balance of the body's fundamental fluids. From the abstract internal world of humoral imbalance, your journey now confronts a much more tangible and persistent challenge to medieval hygiene: pest control and the constant struggle against unwanted roommates. Imagine your home as a shared living space, not just with your family, but with legions of fleas, scurrying lice, omnipresent rats and buzzing flies, all vying for their share of your comfort and your resources. It's like living in a very lively, very itchy, and very unsanitary zoo. You're in a typical medieval dwelling, perhaps a crowded peasant cottage or even a section of a castle. The air is never quite still. There's a faint rustle in the straw bedding, a quick darting shadow in your peripheral vision, and an insistent nagging itch on your skin. This constant presence of unwanted roommates meant that pest control was not an occasional chore, but a continuous, often losing battle for survival and sanity in medieval times. The most common and intimate of these unwanted roommates were fleas and lice. Fleas thriving in the straw bedding, dusty floors, and animal fur, remember beast's burden from section 11, would have been a near-constant torment for almost everyone. Lice, as we briefly touched upon in hair care, section 4, infested hair and clothing, undergarments, section 6, causing incessant itching and discomfort. There were also bedbugs, ticks, and various other crawling insects that viewed human habitations as prime real estate. This is a mainstream historical fact. Fleas, lice, and rats were pervasive pests in medieval households, posing significant challenges to hygiene. The methods for pest control were rudimentary and often ineffective. For fleas, strewing herbs, like those used as natural fresheners in section 16, were scattered on floors, believed to deter them with their strong scents. Burning certain herbs or resins might also have been tried. For lice, constant combing, as in section 4, and occasional washing of hair and clothing with harsh lye soaps or herbal rinses were the primary defences. For bedding, frequent beating and airing, or even replacing straw mattresses, might offer temporary relief, but the cycle of reinfestation was almost inevitable. You can almost feel the phantom itch crawling up your arm, a tiny persistent reminder of the microscopic warfare waged daily. It's like trying to fight a mosquito swarm with a single fly swatter. You might get a few, but the rest are still coming for you. Beyond the biting insects, rodents were a major problem. Rats and mice drawn to abundant food scraps, general rubbish, section 12, and easy shelter infested homes, granaries, and public spaces. They gnawed through food stores, contaminated surfaces with their droppings, and most importantly, served as vectors for dangerous diseases, including the Black Death, which we'll explore further in section 21. Cats were valued for their mousing abilities, and some dogs were kept for ratting, but their efforts were often insufficient against the sheer numbers of rodents. Flies, drawn to every source of organic waste, human, animal and food scraps, swarmed tirelessly, landing on food, faces and everything in between. They were a constant annoyance and, unbeknownst to medieval people, highly effective carriers of pathogens. The pervasive presence of these unwanted roommates meant that medieval people lived in an environment where parasitic and commensal creatures were a constant, tangible threat. This constant interaction with pests significantly undermined any efforts at personal cleanliness or environmental sanitation, creating a continuous cycle of contamination and discomfort. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval medical texts or household manuals actually contain advice on how to get rid of fleas, including bizarre concoctions involving blood, pitch, or even placing sticky substances around beds to trap them, highlighting the desperation of the battle. It's like a medieval life hack video, but the hacks are gross and probably don't work. Historians still argue whether the constant presence of unwanted roommates like fleas and rats was simply an accepted nuisance in medieval life, or if it contributed more directly and significantly to the general poor health and high mortality rates through constant pathogen transmission. Regardless, the continuous struggle for pest control against these pervasive creatures was an undeniable aspect of medieval hygiene, shaping daily discomfort, contributing to the spread of disease, and highlighting the formidable challenges of maintaining cleanliness in a world without modern solutions. From the irritating presence of unwanted roommates, your journey now moves to a far more terrifying consequence of medieval unsanitary conditions, epidemics, and the devastating reality of disease's scourge. Imagine a world where an invisible enemy could sweep through a village or a city claiming lives indiscriminately, leaving fear and desolation in its wake, with no clear understanding of its cause or cure. It's like living under the constant threat of a silent, invisible apocalypse, and your best defense is a hopeful prayer. You're no longer merely observing. You're immersed in the chilling silence of a street where people once bustled, now eerily quiet. A cart laden with shrouded bodies rumbles by, or you hear the frantic prayers from a nearby church. The air, though still carrying the pervasive medieval scents, now has an added grim weight, the palpable fear of contagion. This atmosphere is your stark reminder that epidemics were not just historical footnotes. They were devastating, recurring realities, the ultimate manifestation of disease's scourge in a world with rudimentary hygiene. The most infamous example of disease's scourge was the Black Death, bubonic plague, which decimated Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. But plague was not the only threat. Dysentery, typhoid fever, smallpox, influenza, and various other fevers and respiratory illnesses were constant companions, each capable of claiming countless lives. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe experienced frequent and devastating epidemics, including the Black Death, which caused widespread mortality. The link between poor hygiene and the rapid spread of these epidemics was largely unseen by medieval people. While they might intuitively connect foul smells to illness, the miasma theory, where bad air caused disease, was prevalent, they didn't understand the role of microorganisms. This meant that their efforts to prevent disease were often misdirected or insufficient. Consider the pathways for disease. Contaminated water. Reliance on water sources, as discussed in section 13, like rivers and wells, which were often polluted by human and animal waste, from sections 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, provided a direct route for waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid. You're essentially drinking a diluted, invisible cocktail of illness. Pervasive vermin, the constant presence of unwanted roommates, from section 20, like rats, fleas and flies, acted as highly effective vectors. Fleas on rats transmitted the bubonic plague. Flies, landing on open sores, human waste, and then food, spread gastrointestinal illnesses. It's like living in a giant open-air petri dish, and all the experiments are walking, flying and crawling around you. Unsanitary conditions, the general urban filth, from section 10, accumulated general rubbish, from section 12, an infrequent cleaning of bodies, bathing habits, section 1, and clothing, fabrics filth, section 5, created environments where pathogens could thrive and spread rapidly through direct contact or airborne transmission. Crowded living. Densely packed towns and communal living spaces meant that once a disease entered a community, it could spread with frightening speed, jumping from person to person with terrifying efficiency. When disease's scourge struck, the medical response was largely ineffective. Based on humoral imbalance, from section 19, treatments often involved bloodletting or purging, which could further weaken the patient. Without knowledge of contagion, isolating the sick was difficult, and people might even flee infected areas, unknowingly carrying the disease with them. You can almost hear the frantic ringing of bells for the dead, the mournful cries echoing through the narrow streets, a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability. A quirky tidbit is that medieval people sometimes wore nosegays, or carried pomanders, like those with perfumes and scent from section 17, filled with strong-smelling herbs, believing that these pleasant aromas would protect them from the bad air, miasma, that they thought caused disease. It's like bringing a bouquet of flowers to a biohazard zone, hoping it'll ward off the invisible threats. Historians still argue whether the devastating impact of epidemics on medieval society was primarily due to the lack of medical knowledge and effective treatments, or if the underlying poor hygiene and sanitation created conditions that made populations inherently vulnerable to recurrent outbreaks. Regardless, the constant threat and devastating reality of epidemics represented the ultimate, terrifying consequence of medieval hygiene's shortcomings. It was the starkest manifestation of disease's scourge, shaping demographics, influencing social structures, and instilling a profound fear that lingered for centuries. From the widespread devastation of epidemics and the general lack of sanitation, your journey now shifts to a more ordered, often surprisingly disciplined approach to cleanliness, monastic cleanliness, and the principles of religious purity that guided it. Imagine entering a serene abbey, where the air, while not entirely devoid of earthly smells, is noticeably cleaner, the surroundings more orderly, and the attention to personal and environmental hygiene more pronounced than in the bustling towns. It's like stepping into a medieval clean room, but instead of sterile equipment, you find scrubbing monks and meticulous rules. You're now within the quiet confines of a medieval monastery. The stone cloisters are swept, the refectory tables are wiped, and there's a distinct sense of order that contrasts sharply with the chaos of the urban street. You see monks engaged in daily chores, including the careful maintenance of their living spaces and notably their own persons. This dedication to monastic cleanliness was not merely pragmatic, it was deeply intertwined with the spiritual ideal of religious purity. For monastic orders, cleanliness was often viewed as next to godliness. While they didn't understand germ theory, they intuitively recognized that a clean environment fostered health and order, which were conducive to spiritual contemplation and communal living. Their rules, like the Benedictine rule for many Western monasteries, often prescribed specific routines for personal hygiene and the upkeep of the monastery. This is a mainstream historical fact. Monastic communities often maintained higher standards of hygiene than the general population due to their communal living and religious discipline. Consider the aspects of religious purity in practice: bathing. While not daily, monks often had more regular access to baths than the general populace. Some monasteries had dedicated bathhouses, and bathing might be part of specific rituals or allowed at regular intervals. The emphasis was often on washing away the filth of the world before engaging in sacred duties. It's like a spiritual deep clean meant to purify both body and soul. Hand washing. This was particularly rigorous, especially before and after meals, linking back to hand washing in section 2, and before handling sacred texts or performing religious rites. Basins and clean water were often readily available in the cloister lavatorium. The cleanliness of hands was not just practical, it was symbolic of preparing oneself for holy work. Clothing. Monks typically wore woolen habits, which were difficult to clean, as discussed in clothing hygiene in section 5, but they often wore linen undergarments, from section 6, which were changed and washed more frequently. The monastic laundries were often well organised, ensuring a degree of cleanliness for their closest layers. Latrinas and waste disposal. Monasteries often had more advanced and well-maintained sanitation systems than surrounding towns. They might feature communal latrines, similar to public privies in section 9 but often better managed, built over running water, or sophisticated networks of drains to carry waste away from living quarters. Their isolation and dedicated labour force allowed for better management of animal waste, from section 11, and general rubbish from section 12. Water sources. Monks were often skilled at engineering and would carefully manage their water sources from section 13, sometimes diverting streams or digging deep wells, well water, section 14, to ensure a supply of clean water for drinking, cooking and washing. Their understanding of water flow and contamination, while not scientific, was often pragmatic and effective. Pest control. While not entirely immune to unwanted roommates, from section 20, monastic communities often had more resources and discipline to combat fleas, lice and rodents. Cats were valued, and cleanliness of living spaces reduced breeding grounds. The motivation for this elevated standard of hygiene was multifaceted. Firstly, it was practical. Living in close quarters required a certain degree of cleanliness to prevent discomfort and illness. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it was spiritual. Cleanliness of the body was seen as reflecting cleanliness of the soul, a physical manifestation of devotion and order in a world that often seemed chaotic. It was a visible sign of their disciplined life and separation from the perceived impurities of the secular world. It's like a medieval monastic code that says, keep your habits clean, your soul cleaner, and your latrines, well, as clean as humanly possible. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic infirmaries, their hospitals, actually had surprisingly advanced bathing facilities and drainage systems for their time, reflecting a practical understanding that cleanliness aided in the recovery of the sick. This focus on hygiene in a medical context was often more advanced than in many secular institutions. It's like a medieval hospital having an almost modern plumbing system, just for the sake of getting better. Historians still argue whether the superior hygiene of monasteries was primarily due to their disciplined communal living and dedicated labour force, or if their spiritual focus on religious purity inherently led to more robust practices. Regardless, monastic cleanliness stands as a fascinating exception to the general medieval trend of widespread filth. It highlights how a structured environment, combined with a strong ideological drive for religious purity, could lead to significantly improved hygienic standards, offering a glimpse into what was possible in a challenging era. From the disciplined environment of monastic life, your journey now shifts to the pinnacle of medieval society. Royal hygiene and the often surprising realities of elite practices. Imagine a king or queen surrounded by luxury and served by countless attendants, yet still grappling with hygienic challenges that would astonish you, blending elements of extravagance with persistent medieval realities. It's like discovering that even the richest, most powerful people in the world still had to deal with fleas and a distinct lack of sparkling clean bathrooms. You're now in the opulent, yet still decidedly pre-modern, chambers of a medieval monarch. Silks and tapestries adorn the walls, and the scent of expensive perfumes and scent, from section 17, might linger in the air. Yet, even here, you observe practices that reveal the limitations of the era. A servant might be preparing a rudimentary bath, or a royal barber surgeon, remember them from section 18, might be attending to a royal toothache. This blend of luxury and lingering medieval constraints defined royal hygiene and its elite practices. While royalty and high nobility certainly had access to more resources than the common populace, their hygienic practices were still fundamentally shaped by the technological limitations of the age. They couldn't magically conjure indoor plumbing or germ theory. However, their wealth allowed for more frequent bathing. Kings and queens might take a full bath more often than others, perhaps once a week or every few days, depending on their personal preference and the availability of hot water. Large, often portable, wooden tubs lined with linen were common, and the water might be infused with expensive herbs, herbal remedies, section 16, and fragrant oils. This was a significant luxury, as heating vast quantities of water was a labour-intensive and costly affair. It's like having a medieval hot tub, but it requires a dedicated staff just to fill it. Abundant linen, the elite typically owned many more sets of undergarments from section 6, linen shirts, shifts and brays, allowing for more frequent changes, often daily. This was a crucial factor in maintaining personal freshness, as the linen would absorb sweat and oils, protecting the outer, more elaborate and less frequently washed garments. Clothing hygiene, section 5. Use of perfumes and spices. As discussed earlier, the wealthy actively employed expensive perfumes and scent from exotic ingredients to mask body odours and scent their clothes and chambers. They might also carry personal pomanders. This was a crucial strategy to create an aromatic bubble in a generally pungent environment. Dedicated staff, royal households had specialised servants, including grooms of the stool, responsible for handling chamber pots, nocturnal necessities, Section 8, and attending to the monarch's most intimate needs, and laundresses, who meticulously managed the washing of linen. Better waste management. While not perfect, royal residences, particularly castles, often had more sophisticated latrine logic, from Section 7, with guardrobes dropping into moats or dedicated cesspits that might be emptied more regularly than common privies. However, even these could be problematic. Despite these advantages, royal hygiene still faced significant medieval challenges. Pest control, from Section 20, against fleas, lice and rats remained an ongoing battle, as these creatures did not discriminate based on social status. Even in royal beds, vermin could be a persistent nuisance. The quality of water sources, from Section 13, even from royal wells, well water, Section 14, could still be compromised by broader environmental contamination or rudimentary understanding of microbes. Imagine a king scratching himself due to fleas while signing a royal decree. It certainly challenges the majestic image. The ideal of cleanliness for royalty was often tied to their public image and the notion of divine right. A clean, well-presented monarch conveyed health, power, and divine favour. Therefore, efforts were made to ensure they appeared, and to a degree were, as clean as possible within the technological constraints. A quirky tidbit is that King Louis IX of France, who reigned in the 13th century, was renowned for his personal piety, and, unusually for his time, his relative cleanliness, reportedly bathing more frequently than many of his royal contemporaries. This suggests that individual preferences and religious conviction could also significantly influence royal hygiene, not just wealth. It's like a medieval monarch having a secret obsession with hygiene that makes him stand out from his peers. Historians still argue whether the somewhat higher standards of royal hygiene significantly impacted the health and longevity of monarchs compared to the general population, or if the pervasive disease environment, recall epidemics, Section 21, largely negated these personal efforts. Regardless, the elite practices of royal hygiene offer a fascinating glimpse into the possibilities and limitations of cleanliness at the very top of medieval society, showcasing a blend of luxurious efforts and persistent challenges in a world still grappling with fundamental sanitation. From the somewhat elevated, yet still constrained, standards of royal hygiene, your journey descends to the practical, often grim, reality of the vast majority: peasant hygiene and the ever-present challenge of daily grime. Imagine a life dictated by manual labour, with limited access to resources, where cleanliness was a luxury often sacrificed for survival, and the pervasive dirt was less a nuisance and more a fact of existence. It's like living in a permanent state of freshly turned earth, but the earth also smells like animals and unwashed bodies. You're now in a humble peasant dwelling, perhaps a wattle and daub cottage with a thatched roof, or a small hovel in a village. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint but undeniable aroma of unwashed bodies and lingering animal presence. You see simple tools, rough clothing, and an overall sense of pragmatism. This is the world of peasant hygiene, where the battle against daily grime was a constant, often losing, fight driven by necessity rather than leisure. For the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasants, serfs, and common labourers, hygiene was primarily about survival and functionality rather than comfort or aesthetic ideals. Their lives were dominated by agricultural cycles and demanding physical labour, leaving little time or resources for elaborate cleanliness rituals. This is a mainstream historical fact. Peasant hygiene was characterised by pragmatism and limited resources, focusing on basic functionality over extensive cleaning. Consider the daily challenges and approaches to daily grime. Infrequent full bathing. Full body bathing, as we discussed in Section 1, was a rare event. Peasants typically had no personal tubs, and heating large quantities of water was an immense chore, costing precious fuel and time. A bath might occur a few times a year, perhaps in a communal stream or river during warmer months, or in a shared tub if one was available. Spot cleaning. The most common form of personal cleanliness was spot cleaning. A peasant would wash their face and hands, refer back to hand washing in Section 2, in a basin of cold water, or simply wipe themselves down with a damp cloth. This removed visible dirt but did little for ingrained grime or body odour. Clothing. Peasants typically owned very few garments, often just 1 or 2 sets of rough wool or linen. Outer garments. Clothing hygiene section 5 would be worn for weeks or months without a full wash, aired out, brushed or beaten to remove dust. While they likely wore linen undergarments from section 6, against the skin, changes and washes of these were also far less frequent than for the nobility, dictated by the labour of washing and the availability of a second set. You can almost feel the persistent itch of worn wool, the ingrained dust, and the dampness that never quite dries out. It's like wearing the same pair of jeans for a month straight, but without the modern fabrics designed for such abuse. Latrines and waste. For most peasants, waste disposal was rudimentary. A simple pit latrine, as covered in Latrine Logic section 7, or a designated area in the yard or a nearby field was common. Chamber pots, from section 8, would be used at night, and their contents typically emptied onto a dung heap for fertiliser or directly into a field. Water sources. Peasants relied on local water sources from section 13, like wells, well water, section 14, rivers, or streams for all their needs. These were often shared with animals, animal waste, section 11, and vulnerable to contamination, meaning their drinking water was frequently unsafe. Pest control. Living in close proximity to animals and natural environments meant peasants were constantly battling unwanted roommates, from section 20 like fleas, lice and rodents. Their homes, often with earthen floors and thatched roofs, provided ideal breeding grounds, making pest control an unending and largely unsuccessful struggle. The pervasive daily grime was not simply an aesthetic issue. It contributed to widespread skin ailments, infections, and a constant baseline of discomfort. Body odour was a universal fact of life, as was the presence of parasites. This environmental reality, combined with rudimentary medical theory, from section 19, meant that peasants were highly vulnerable to epidemics, from section 21, when they struck. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval peasant homes would have a central hearth for heating and cooking, and the smoke, while making the interior quite sooty, might have offered some minor antiseptic benefits by killing airborne bacteria, even if it caused respiratory issues. It's like a medieval air purifier that also gives you lung problems. Historians still argue whether the perceived lower standards of peasant hygiene were primarily due to a lack of awareness regarding cleanliness's importance, or if they were simply an unavoidable consequence of the extreme poverty, demanding labour, and limited resources that defined peasant life. Regardless, peasant hygiene represented a pragmatic adaptation to a challenging existence. The constant battle against daily grime was a defining characteristic of their lives, underscoring the vast disparity in living conditions and hygienic possibilities between the majority of medieval society and the privileged few. From the ingrained grit of peasant hygiene, your journey now shifts to the tender beginnings of life, observing how cleanliness was approached for the youngest members of medieval society, childhood hygiene, and the early habits that shaped their lives. Imagine a newborn wrapped in swaddling clothes, or a toddler learning to navigate a world full of dirt and disease, and the rudimentary efforts made to keep them clean, healthy, and hopefully alive. It's like medieval baby care where the lullabies might be sweet, but the changing table hygiene leaves much to be desired. You're observing a medieval mother, perhaps by a hearth or in a simple chamber, tending to her infant or small child. There are no disposable diapers, no baby wipes, no antiseptic creams. Instead, you see rough cloths, warm but not necessarily hot water, and a great deal of practical improvisation. This intimate scene reveals the challenges of childhood hygiene and the formation of early habits in a world where infants were particularly vulnerable to illness. Newborns were typically swaddled, often tightly, in strips of cloth. These cloths would naturally become soiled. Changing them was a regular, though likely not immediate occurrence. The baby would be cleaned with warm water and soft cloths. But true bathing was infrequent, generally part of the overall family bathing schedule, as mentioned in section 1. The challenge was keeping the baby warm and clean in an environment often lacking both. This is a mainstream historical fact. Infants were swaddled and cleaned with cloths, but full baths were infrequent. For toddlers and young children, whose explorations inevitably led to contact with the pervasive daily grime, from section 24, and urban filth, from section 10, cleanliness was an ongoing battle, Their hands and faces would be wiped often, especially before eating. They might be encouraged to wash their hands, recalling hand washing in Section 2 before meals, but enforcement would have been inconsistent. Clothing for children, much like adults, was usually made of linen or wool, and often hand-me-downs. Children's linen undergarments, from Section 6, would be changed more frequently than their outer layers, providing a modicum of freshness. However, the sheer volume of laundry generated by young children, combined with the labour involved in washing, clothing hygiene, Section 5, meant that absolute cleanliness was a distant ideal. You can almost smell the faint sour scent of spilled milk and unwashed clothing that likely clung to many medieval children. It's like a permanent faint baby smell, but with a lot more complexity. Toilet training, as we understand it, was certainly different. Without specialised equipment, children would learn to relieve themselves in designated areas, often simply outside, in a corner, or into a chamber pot, from Section 8, if one was available and accessible. The concept of accidents was likely just part of daily life, managed with cloths and a pragmatic approach to immediate clean-up. The constant presence of unwanted roommates, from Section 20, like fleas and lice, was a particular concern for children, who had thinner skin and often spent more time in close contact with floors and animals. Parents would have regularly combed their children's hair, referencing hair care in Section 4 to remove lice and nits, a tedious but necessary task. The mortality rate for medieval infants and children was extremely high, and while factors like nutrition and lack of medical understanding certainly played a major role, as seen in epidemics, Section 21, and medical theory, Section 19, poor hygiene undoubtedly contributed. Infections from contaminated water, water sources, Section 13, and well water, Section 14, or from direct contact with human and animal waste, from Section 11, would have been common, especially in children whose immune systems were still developing. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval lullabies and folk remedies actually contain verses or instructions related to warding off worms or creeping things, likely referring to parasites, indicating the constant concern parents had for their children's physical discomforts related to hygiene. It's like a medieval nursery rhyme that's also a warning about bedbugs. Historians still argue whether medieval parents were genuinely indifferent to their children's hygiene due to cultural norms, or if their limited resources and overwhelming daily struggles simply made comprehensive cleanliness an impossibility. Regardless, childhood hygiene in medieval times was a pragmatic, often basic affair. The early habits formed were largely dictated by necessity, reflecting a world where cleanliness was a continuous uphill battle, especially for the most vulnerable members of society. From the intimate struggles of childhood hygiene, your journey now expands to a far broader and often grim reality for anyone leaving the confines of their home: travellers' trials and the inescapable grime of on-the-go dirt. Imagine embarking on a journey across medieval landscapes, where every road was unpaved, every inn a potential hotbed of filth, and the concept of a refreshing rest stop with clean facilities simply didn't exist. It's like a permanent, very long road trip, but every gas station bathroom is a horror movie set, and the road food is whatever you can scrape off your boots. You're a medieval traveller, perhaps a merchant on a long journey, a pilgrim heading to a holy site, or a knight riding to a distant tournament. Your clothes, already subject to fabric's filth, from Section 5, quickly accumulate layers of road dust, mud and horse sweat. Your skin feels perpetually gritty. Your hair care Section 4, matted and unkempt. This is the pervasive reality of travellers' trials, a constant battle against on-the-go dirt that few, if any, could truly win. The infrastructure for travel in medieval times was rudimentary. Roads were often little more than tracks, turning into muddy quagmires in wet weather or dusty clouds in dry periods. This meant that travellers, whether on foot, horseback or in carts, were constantly exposed to the elements and the ubiquitous dirt of the landscape. Your feet, even in sturdy boots, would inevitably become caked with mud, and your clothing would bear the indelible marks of the journey. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval travel was often arduous, and travellers constantly contended with pervasive dirt and limited opportunities for cleanliness. Opportunities for personal hygiene were extremely limited. Bathing, a full bath, as discussed in Section 1, was an exceptional luxury, almost impossible to arrange while on the road. Inns might occasionally offer a heated bath, but this would be expensive. often shared, and likely in water that had already seen multiple occupants. Communal cleansing, section 15. For most, any washing would be a quick rinse in a cold stream or at a public well water, section 14, with minimal soap if any. Clothing. Changing clothes was impractical. Most travellers owned only the clothes they wore, perhaps one spare set of undergarments, from section 6, carried in a pack. Washing clothes on the road was a laborious task, requiring finding a suitable water source, having soap, often harsh, and then waiting for clothes to dry, which was often impossible given travel schedules. This meant clothing would become increasingly soiled and odorous over the course of a journey, contributing to the traveller's trials. Latrines and waste. There were no dedicated public restrooms. For nature's call, travellers would seek out a secluded bush, a ditch, or simply relieve themselves by the roadside. This contributed to the general unsanitary conditions of travel routes, and certainly didn't help with personal cleanliness. Imagine having to find a discreet spot every time, hoping you don't stumble upon someone else's recent contribution to the landscape. It's like a very unglamorous treasure hunt, where the treasure is just a quiet corner, food and water. Meals were often simple, eaten with unwashed hands, linking back to hand washing in section 2. Water sources along the road were often questionable, drawn from streams or public wells that could be contaminated by human or animal waste, from section 11. This put travellers at significant risk of epidemics, from section 21, like dysentery. The presence of unwanted roommates, from section 20, like fleas and lice, was almost guaranteed for travellers. Inns and lodging houses, often crowded and rarely cleaned thoroughly, were prime breeding grounds for these parasites, easily transferring them from bedding to clothing to person. A night's rest often meant acquiring new, unwelcome companions. You're constantly scratching an itch you can't quite locate, a persistent reminder of the tiny invisible army accompanying your journey. Furthermore, the lack of regular hygiene made travellers more susceptible to various ailments. Skin irritations, chafing, foot sores and general discomfort were common. The constant exposure to the elements and accumulated dirt wore down the body's defences. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval travel guides actually advised pilgrims or merchants to carry small sachets of dried herbs, herbal remedies, section 16, or even small pomanders, perfumes and scents, section 17, to combat the foul odours encountered during their journeys, highlighting the practical recognition of the pervasive stench of travel. It's like having a medieval car air freshener, but you have to sniff it manually, and it's probably filled with potpourri. Historians still argue whether the physical hardships and unsanitary conditions of medieval travel were primarily a cause of disease among travellers, or if the act of travel itself, by spreading populations, also contributed to the wider dissemination of epidemics between communities. Regardless, travellers' trials were an undeniable and arduous aspect of medieval life. The relentless accumulation of on-the-go dirt, coupled with severely limited opportunities for hygiene, meant that journeys were not just physically demanding but also significant challenges to personal cleanliness and well-being. From the pervasive grime of travellers' trials, your focus now shifts to the intimate tools of medieval personal care. Personal items and the surprisingly limited array of combs and cloths that were your daily companions for hygiene. Imagine a world where your entire personal grooming kit consisted of just a few simple objects, constantly reused, rarely truly clean, and passed down through generations. It's like having a beauty cabinet with just 3 items, and 2 of them are just slightly different types of scratchy rags. You're looking at a small, rough wooden box, perhaps on a chest in a modest home, or tucked away in a noble's travel satchel. Inside you might find a piece of rough linen, a small worn piece of pumice stone and a comb. These humble objects represent the extent of most medieval people's personal items for hygiene, a stark contrast to the overflowing bathroom shelves of today. The daily reliance on these basic combs and cloths highlights the scarcity of specialised tools and the pragmatic approach to cleanliness. The most ubiquitous and essential of these personal items was the comb. As we touched upon in hair care, section 4, combs, typically made of bone, wood or ivory, were vital for detangling hair and, crucially, for removing lice and nits. You can almost feel the stiff tines scraping against your scalp, a familiar sensation of basic grooming and the constant battle against unwanted roommates, from section 20. There were often 2 types, a wide-toothed comb for detangling and a very fine-toothed comb specifically for removing parasites. This is a mainstream historical fact. Combs were essential personal hygiene tools used for both hair management and pest removal. Cloths, usually made of rough linen or wool, were the primary implement for washing the face, hands, referencing hand washing in section 2, and any other parts of the body during spot cleaning or infrequent full baths from section 1. These cloths were rarely new and disposable. They would be used, rinsed if water was available, and then reused repeatedly. Their own cleanliness would often be questionable, potentially acting as a vector for grime rather than a true cleanser. Imagine wiping your face with a cloth that has seen many uses and not so thorough rinses. It's a far cry from a fresh cotton ball. Beyond combs and cloths, other personal items were even rarer. Pumice stone, a porous, abrasive volcanic rock, sometimes used for scrubbing rough skin, particularly on the feet, or perhaps for rudimentary exfoliation. Simple knife or razor. For men, a sharp knife or razor might be used for shaving, though professional barber surgeons, from section 18, were often preferred for this task, especially for the wealthy. These tools were usually unsterilised and multi-purpose. Ear spoons, small, often decorative, metal or bone instruments used to clean earwax. While perhaps more hygienic than a finger, these too would have been shared or reused without sterilisation. Toothcloths or rudimentary toothbrushes. As mentioned in Oral Care, section 3, a piece of cloth was the most common toothbrush. Some evidence suggests very simple chewing sticks or rudimentary brushes existed, but they were rare and often just softened twigs. The very limited range of these personal items meant that medieval hygiene was inherently basic. There was no concept of individual single-use toiletries. Tools were shared among family members, or used for multiple purposes without thorough cleaning, potentially spreading localized infections. The emphasis was on what was practical and available, not on what was sterile or truly effective by modern standards. You can almost feel the gritty texture of these tools, the sense of wear, and the shared history they held within a family. It's like a medieval starter kit for personal care, and it definitely prioritises function over luxury. A quirky tidbit is that archaeological digs at medieval sites sometimes uncover beautifully carved bone or ivory combs, suggesting that even these functional hygiene tools could be objects of personal adornment and craftsmanship, particularly for the wealthier classes. It's like a medieval person, splurging on a fancy toothbrush, even if it didn't really clean better. Historians still argue whether the limited range and shared nature of personal items like combs and cloths played a significant role in the constant reinfestation of individuals with parasites and the spread of skin ailments, or if these were minor contributors compared to broader environmental factors. Regardless, the reliance on such basic tools meant that medieval hygiene was a daily negotiation with fundamental limitations. These humble objects were at the forefront of the individual's attempts to manage their own cleanliness, shaping their intimate daily routines in a world where true sterility was an unknown concept. From the very tangible personal items used for medieval grooming, your journey now shifts to a more abstract, yet profoundly impactful aspect of medieval life: odour perception, and how the medieval nose adapted to a world teeming with smells you'd find utterly overwhelming. Imagine a society where the air was a constant, complex blend of scents, some familiar, some repulsive, and how the very way people smelled and how they perceived those smells was radically different from your own. It's like living in a permanent scratch and sniff book, but many of the scents are stale or rotting. You're now walking through a medieval marketplace. Your modern senses are assaulted by a cacophony of smells. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread mingles with the pungent tang of unwashed bodies. The sharp scent of animal waste, beast's burden, from section 11. The earthy dampness of straw and the metallic tang of blood from the butcher's stall. This overwhelming sensory input is your immediate clue that the medieval nose operated in a fundamentally different olfactory landscape, influencing their very odour perception. Modern societies, with their emphasis on cleanliness and pervasive artificial fragrances, live in a relatively sanitised olfactory environment. Our noses are accustomed to a baseline of freshness, and are quick to detect and be repulsed by what we perceive as foul odours. For medieval people, however, the baseline was much, much different. They lived in constant proximity to smells that would send you reeling. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval people had a different tolerance and perception of odours compared to modern individuals due to constant exposure to a wider range of strong smells. Consider how their odour perception was shaped. Constant exposure. From the moment they woke up to the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bedding, to walking through streets filled with urban filth from Section 10 and general rubbish from Section 12, to working closely with animals or handling raw materials, medieval people were bombarded by strong smells. Their olfactory systems would have adapted, making them less sensitive to some odours that we would find overpowering. It's like living next to a busy highway. Eventually, the constant hum of traffic fades into the background, and you only notice it when it stops. Pragmatism over aesthetics. The primary concern with odours was often practical. A truly foul smell might indicate decay, sickness, or a fire prompting action. But everyday body odour, the scent of a working animal, or the smell of a busy street was simply the norm. There was less emphasis on eliminating all natural body odours, and more on masking the most offensive ones, as seen with perfumes and scent from Section 17 and herbal remedies from Section 16. The miasma theory. As briefly touched upon in medical theory, Section 19, a prevalent belief was that disease was caused by miasma, bad air or noxious fumes arising from decaying matter. This meant that truly foul smells were not just unpleasant, they were perceived as actively dangerous, carrying disease. This would have shaped odour perception to be highly attuned to what they considered unhealthy smells, often distinct from mere unpleasantness. You might instinctively wrinkle your nose at a truly putrid stench, not just because it's bad, but because your medieval brain is screaming disease. Cultural acceptance, social norms played a significant role. What we consider polite or rude in terms of personal scent is a modern construct. In a world where everyone had some degree of body odour, it was simply part of the human condition. Imagine a medieval court where the king himself might have a subtle, musky scent. It was simply part of being human. It's like a medieval fashion trend where everyone smells slightly earthy. The efforts to combat pervasive smells through strewing herbs, wearing pomanders, or using powerful animal-based perfumes highlight that while their tolerance for odours was higher, they were not entirely oblivious or immune to unpleasantness. They sought relief, but their methods were about managing, not eliminating, the omnipresent odours. You can almost feel the instinctive sniff of a pomander, a small personal refuge from the larger sensory landscape. A quirky tidbit is that medieval texts sometimes describe people having a distinct natural smell, unique to individuals or families, and that this scent was often seen as an inherent part of their identity, not necessarily something to be entirely eradicated. It's like a medieval version of a signature scent, but it's entirely organic and might involve a bit of body odour. From the fascinating realm of odour perception and the unique capabilities of the medieval nose, your journey now culminates by looking forward, considering the lasting impact of these historical hygiene practices, hygiene's legacy, and the faint yet persistent modern lessons we can draw from them. Imagine peering through the mists of time, realising that while medieval life was undeniably grim by modern standards, the fundamental human drive for cleanliness, however rudimentary, laid the groundwork for the sanitary revolutions to come. It's like tracing the faint, muddy footsteps of your ancestors, realising that even their struggle to stay clean contributes to your sparkling shower today. You're back in your own time, in your own comfortable, clean surroundings. The medieval smells have faded, replaced by the crisp scent of modern air and the quiet hum of filtered air conditioning. But the echoes of that pungent past linger, informing your appreciation for the unseen systems that protect your health daily. This is the essence of hygiene's legacy, a subtle but profound connection between medieval struggles and the modern lessons that underpin our contemporary understanding of public health. While medieval hygiene was largely driven by practical necessity, visible dirt, and intuitive responses to unpleasantness, like using herbal remedies from Section 16, or perfumes and scent from Section 17, rather than germ theory, medical theory Section 19, it laid crucial groundwork. The very act of attempting to manage waste, latrine logic, Section 7, chamber pots, Section 8, public privies, Section 9, to clean streets, street sanitation, Section 10, and to secure better water sources, Section 13, well water, Section 14, however imperfectly, represented humanity's early stumbling steps towards public health. This is a mainstream historical fact. Despite their limitations, medieval attempts at hygiene, particularly in urban areas and monasteries, laid foundational, if unscientific, groundwork for later public health advancements. Consider the modern lessons emerging from this historical perspective. The importance of sanitation infrastructure, the pervasive urban filth, Section 10, and the challenges of waste disposal, Section 12, highlight the absolute necessity of robust modern sewage systems, waste collection, and clean water delivery. Without these, even personal efforts are undermined. You can almost hear the quiet hum of your modern plumbing, a symphony of unseen pipes carrying away waste, a direct descendant of medieval struggles with open sewers. It's like realising your toilet is actually a marvel of engineering rather than just a porcelain bowl. The power of clean water. The constant threat from contaminated water sources underscores why clean, potable water is a cornerstone of modern public health. The widespread use of ale and cider in medieval times, due to boiling in the brewing process, provides a stark historical example of how populations adapted to unsafe water, even if they didn't fully understand why it was safer. The relentless battle against pests, the constant struggle against unwanted roommates, Section 20, like rats, fleas and lice, reminds us that pest control isn't just about comfort, it's about breaking disease transmission cycles. Our modern pest control methods, from sealed food containers to pesticides, are a direct response to millennia of living with these vectors. The vulnerability to epidemics, the devastating impact of epidemics, Section 21, like the Black Death, serves as a powerful historical warning. It shows how rapidly diseases can spread in unsanitary conditions and without medical understanding, reinforcing the importance of public health surveillance, vaccination, and rapid response in our own era. The value of basic personal hygiene. While medieval practices were rudimentary, the inherent human drive to wash hands, hand-washing Section 2, care for hair, hair care Section 4, and change undergarments Section 6, reveals a persistent desire for cleanliness. These fundamental practices, amplified by modern soap and water, remain our first line of defence against many common illnesses. Even the limited personal items, Section 27, they possessed were a testament to this drive. A quirky tidbit is that the very word privy, for a latrine, comes from the medieval concept of a private place, even though many medieval privies were far from private, reflecting a societal yearning for discretion even when it wasn't fully achievable. It's like calling a communal changing room a private suite. Historians still argue whether the slow evolution of hygienic practices from medieval times to the early modern period was primarily due to gradual technological advancements, a shift in scientific understanding, the eventual discovery of germ theory, or changing social values regarding cleanliness and modesty. Regardless, hygiene's legacy is clear. The persistent challenges of the medieval world, the often crude solutions, and the devastating consequences of their failures directly inform our modern appreciation for sanitation. The modern lessons from medieval hygiene are a reminder that clean water, effective waste disposal, and personal cleanliness are not just conveniences. They are fundamental pillars of public health and societal well-being, born from centuries of incremental, often painful human progress. As you drift now, away from the pungent streets and dimly lit chambers of medieval times, let the sounds and smells of that distant era gently fade. The pervasive odours, the constant battles with dirt and disease, the simple tools of daily hygiene, all soften into the quiet of the night. Remember the resilience of those who lived through it, their pragmatic approach to cleanliness in a world that offered few easy solutions. The scratching of linen, the earthy scent of straw, and the faint whisper of distant bells now blend into the gentle murmur of sleep, just as the challenges of medieval hygiene gave way to the clean comforts of your own bed. You've journeyed through a world where clean was a daily aspiration, not a guarantee, where every sip of water held a risk, and every step brought contact with the Earth's unfiltered reality. But even in that harsh era, the human spirit sought comfort, a cleaner breath, a moment of freshness. Let those distant struggles lull you now, knowing that the journey towards a healthier, cleaner world is one of humanity's enduring collective stories. Sweet dreams,